We're going to look at our final family, the Osberger family. We always like to start with the positive parts of adoption because obviously, as I said last week, you will be working with families that things are going astray and you're trying to get them back on track. These are people that share their stories and talk about why they made the decision to adopt that they did, how it worked out for them. I believe the Augsburgers, I think I've got the right family here. They're an older couple who decided to adopt later in life after their lives were somewhat settled. And as they said, they had good jobs, they could travel, they could do what they wanted, and decided that they were going to adopt. And they kind of talk about how it worked out for them, what their struggles were, but I find them interesting.
Well, we started thinking about it when we were in Houston and kind of touched on the subject every once in a while after we got married. Maybe we should think about adoption. And then we didn't, it's not really a serious thought. And we moved to North Carolina and thought a little bit more about it. And my job at the university has an adoption and foster care program in it. And I learned that you could do respite care. So I was like, oh, Jim, we can do respite care, weekends only.
You see the thought process here? We can do a noble thing without really disrupting our lives. On Friday, I at that time in my career had a lunch meeting, and I remember getting the phone call. She knows that I'm at the lunch meeting on Friday. Why is she paging me in the middle of my meeting? And it was interesting how she broke the whole scenario. Well, they have an emergency placement. It's really important. This child has to come here. He's fairly young. He's only 17 months old. And well, I'm pretty well trained. And my response was, well, good, we're going to have a rational discussion about this. And you're going to tell me what we're going to do, just like always. And then she said, well, it's this toddler and his two sisters. And I said, two sisters? How old are they? And she said, well, they're actually sort of 8 and 11. And I said, have you lost your mind? And she said, well, we do have room. I said, well, you're quite right about that. We do have lots of room. But are you sure you want that we need to do this? And she said, well, yes, she really was convinced this was the right thing to do. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, my contribution is I'll come home from work an hour early. In the meantime, let me know what arrangements you make. And I remember when we got home and they brought in these three children, one of them looked at me and they didn't ask the questions I thought they would ask. Where am I going to sleep? And where am I going to go to school? Where, is that dog going to bite me? The first two questions were, do you all go to church? And we do. And do you all eat pork? And I said to her, there's a ham in the refrigerator. You want some? And that's how we got started. And these were children who were not exactly the children we thought we might have chosen originally, because one of them was a toddler. One of us doesn't have much experience with toddlers.
That would be me.
And one of them was going to become in short order a teenager. And one of us didn't really mind taking children, but didn't want one that would ever become a teenager.
That would be me.
We had some getting ready to do, and fostering got us ready to do that. Fostering got us ready to become adoptive parents, because while I have grown children, Kim's never had any. And we had a lot to learn.
We'd had the children here just about a month, and we both kind of one night said, I can't imagine these children being anywhere else. There were other issues going on with the previous foster placement, so it was not something that we could just immediately start the adoption process. But we told the social worker that we had hoped to adopt these children when the time was right, and it did take a full year, but it was certainly worth every month of waiting. But it really was we came to the decision at the same time, and it was almost exactly a month after they'd been here, and just couldn't imagine them ever being anyplace else.
We've had a lot of people who question not our motives, but our sanity. We are at a place in our lives where most adults are putting the parenting role behind them and beginning to enjoy the fruits of long careers and that sort of thing. We've had a lot of people who, sort of wonder why we do this. It's kind of fun to tell them. It really is. I have someone at work who heard through the grapevine that my wife and I adopted 3 children. He's interested in fostering. We'll recruit them.
It's not just other people that think we're crazy. We thought we were crazy. It's hard not to think about when Brandon came, he was almost 2, and when he gets out of high school, I don't want to think about how old I'll be. But there's advantages and disadvantages, definitely. I mean, we know so much more than a 25-year-old parent does, and it's just, we can provide more opportunities than a lot of the younger parents. But that was an issue, particularly for our oldest child, because she wasn't used to having expectations and old parents. So it's been kind of a fun journey trying to overcome the stereotypes of an older parent.
It's true. This has been an adventure, all right. And on a moment-to-moment basis, we can pick out some times we just as soon do without. Thank you very much. But Kim is right. This has been the most rewarding period of our marriage by a long shot, being able to share the gift of children with one another. We would do it again in a heartbeat.
They had a bum deal in life for the first few years of their lives. It's over, and they have a permanent family, and that'll always be part of their history. But it's time for them to move on, us to move on and be a family, and it's so neat to see these kids grow up. I mean, it really is. I'm so excited to see in 10 or 15 years what they're going to achieve, and they're becoming caring people, sympathetic people, and learning not to constantly blame their history. And that's really neat, because we all have stuff in our backgrounds that we need to just let go and move on.
One of the things is to treat them from the beginning as if they were members of our family. And we didn't really ever refer to them as foster children, and they are not now adopted children. These are our children.
I cannot imagine our lives without the kids in our home, and it's just been a blessing. I look so forward to seeing them grow up, and it's so neat to see Jessica as a 13, almost 14-year-old becoming this mature young woman who's changed so much in the last 2 years, and just seeing how she's doing great in school and having good friends and participating. It's really neat. I can't wait to see the other 2 grow up as well, and they're going to be really good parents because they know what it's like now. They will not repeat this, as kids in foster care systems so often do, having children when they're children. They're not going to have that happen because they have good roots now, and just look forward to seeing them grow up. Choose adoption for the right reason. Do it because you want to bring a child into your home or children into your home, and make them part of your family, not a stranger who's brought into your home and kind of not really accepted as a full member. Do it because you want to love this child and help them make a difference in the world. As Jim said, I didn't have birth children, and my idea of adoption was kind of like Diane Keaton in Baby Boom, one of my favorite movies. The baby arrived at her doorstep, the toddler arrived at her doorstep, and Lord knows I didn't expect 3 children at my doorstep, but that's exactly what happened. And I wouldn't trade the last 2 years for anything, but it's been a struggle at times. I was used to doing what I wanted when I wanted, and we'd go on a trip at the drop of a hat. But the rewards of seeing these kids become such neat young adults and almost teenagers and almost a kindergartner has just been remarkable. And that's the most exciting thing. And I look forward to the years ahead with all 3 of them.
I think that it's important that as foster parents, we respect the system. We don't have to think the system is perfect, and we actually don't, but it's very important we respect the system that we have because it's society's effort to do the best it can do. It's not perfect. Children in foster care come with baggage very often. Parents who come to foster care sometimes have baggage too. And we felt it very important for the children's health because the kids have to come first. The system teaches you that, but we really believe that. And we tried all the time while they were foster placements with us to act with that in mind.
Everyone should have considered adopting an older child. It was something I didn't necessarily want to do, but as it was pointed out by a very wise man, all children become older children at some point. So we have such a great range of ages with our children, from a 4-year-old to a 13-year-old. So we get the full spectrum. There are so many children out there in the foster care system waiting for adoption, most of whom are older children, preteens to 17 and 18-year-olds. And these people deserve a home, deserve a family, so they have a chance in life, because it is so difficult to go out on their own the second the system lets them go at age 18. They just don't have any sense about life. They have to learn that through a family, and there are so many kids out there. Occasionally there's a baby, but usually that's with a sibling group. So you're gonna have to just get over the want a baby thing and go for those kids, because they're out there and they all deserve a home.
And think of the values that we grew up with. We knew that when we got out of high school, our parents would point us toward college. Our parents would be there for us to help us begin formation of adult goals. We knew that our parents would be there for us to bring that first grandchild home to. We knew that our parents would be there for us until we needed to be there for them. That's the way family life is supposed to be. Children in foster care have as much right to that as do people like Kim and myself who grew up in a family without the disruption. Adoption, even of an older child, sure, it means that you have to pass up the joys of raising an infant, the joys of potty training a toddler, the joys of dealing with early teenagehood, if any of those there be. But nonetheless, if people who have the capacity to do this don't do it, the child is hurt, the child's future generations are hurt. It's important that people with the capacity to adopt a child into their family and have the wherewithal to do it, do so. And the wherewithal doesn't mean the money, it means the emotional wherewithal, which I think is by far a greater price to pay.
For those who are maybe afraid of adopting, it is a serious thing, and you really need to think thoroughly through the repercussions of what will happen. We hear about a lot of parents when they hear about adoption, well, I don't want any kids with behavioral problems or emotional problems or any kind of baggage whatsoever. Every child has something, whether you give birth to them or they're adopted. It is worth the risk, but you need to be ready for it, and don't take it lightly. It's not to get a new buddy in your house. It's to get a child, and every child has needs, no matter if you gave birth or if they're adopted. So seriously consider it. And if you think it's the right thing to do, start the training and go through the process, and the right child will be placed with you.
So you can see why they put these people on the record. You know, there are many things that with all of these people, we looked at Mr. Hancock and a single man adopting. We looked at I think that this is the single mother that adopted the 3 children. The Mitchells, we saw them last week. He had been in foster care, and they had made a conscious decision to foster after they had their own biological children. And then you get people like this who clearly have had economic advantages, emotional advantages. They're older people, they're on a second marriage. They're settled. They probably have, one might guess that they are financially set. And they're talking about the reasons that they decided to go ahead and adopt. Um, the one thing I will say about Mrs. Oxberger is that I hope none of these children go astray, because clearly she's under the impression that this is never going to happen again. Well, those of us who are in child welfare know that it does, that that damage from early childhood can often pop its head up as time goes on. They're kind of at the beginning of their journey when this is filmed, and they're talking about the fact that these kids are never going to repeat this. We never know that. We don't know that with our own kids, do we? We don't know what's going to happen. But they clearly are settled. They are understanding that they have to give the children first and that they take second. So they're a good example of a solid adoptive family. Charmaine, you said you picked up a couple of cases this week with adoption. Are there any complications in those cases?
It doesn't appear to be yet, but I just picked them up yesterday, and I need to go over the notes and stuff. But it looks like one is they are out of state,
Uh-huh.
and the other one is here, but it doesn't look like it yet because parents have TPR'd.
Okay.
We'll see.
Yeah, no kidding. We will. When you say out of state, you mean the family that the kids are going to?
The grandparents, both of
Oh.
them are going to grandparents,
Okay.
but
We've
mother
heard-
and them were here.
I'm sorry.
Mother and the children were here, but then
Oh.
they went to the grandmother.
But it's gone through TPR.
Mm-hmm.
We've had quite a few cases where kids are being placed with relatives in other states. A lot of the times when we get involved in those cases, it's to provide some kind of visitation, which obviously has to be done through telehealth. But it's really important, especially if they don't know the people that they're going to, or the people that they're going to don't know them. So that's usually our involvement in those cases, is to try to set up visitation and help people get used to each other. We have had, sadly, some really difficult cases that have exploded once kids have gone to other relatives. And there was one particular case that we had a few years ago where an aunt came forward and wanted to adopt. And she was, I forget where she was. She was in way another state, like Arkansas or someplace. And she refused to do visitation. She refused to do phone screens. She refused to do anything. And these were young children, and they did go with her. I'm not sure, and I wouldn't even want to say who the case management agency was, but they did allow the adoption to go forward, and it blew up almost immediately. And then the kids were back here. So, but with the out of state or with the relatives that come forward, sometimes they really don't know these kids. So every support that you can give that family structure is very important.
Well,
So,
what's interesting about one of the cases, the one I'm telling you about out of state, she's got 3 of the grandchildren and the mom is pregnant again, and she's not
boy.
going to take another child. So that'll be interesting to see how that develops, because she'll probably, the baby will be in our system. So
Yeah, unfortunately, life does go on. And with a lot of these moms, I mean, they're young and they continue to get pregnant, and then you have to, within the system, deal with the ramifications of all of that. Now, obviously, you're looking at grandparents who are going to take a sibling set, and then there'll be another sibling that won't be in that set. So yeah, there's a lot of complications with these cases. So
yeah.
Rebecca, I didn't mean to exclude you when I said, does anybody have anything to say?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I know we can't see her, but she's right there. Yeah.
Hi.
Okay, I will have to tell you that this is probably one of the very first trainings that we ever developed when we started Circle of Friends in 2009. I have modified it a million times along the way, because just as you continue to learn, so do I. And so we continue to modify and adapt to new knowledge as we go along. But the one thing that we absolutely know is that maltreated children do not develop the same way a child who's been raised in usual circumstances develops. So, and we have absolutely learned through the research of probably the last 25 years that kids who are traumatized or maltreated in the first 5 years of their life, their brain does not develop the same way a child in normal circumstances does. So this is the task that we try to help adoptive parents with, that you are going to adopt a child, and that child is probably, say you adopt a 9-year-old, that child is not necessarily going to have a 9-year-old brain. That child isn't necessarily going to have developed the same way a 9-year-old in normal circumstances would develop. So helping adoptive parents to understand how they can reverse that, because you can. You can reverse maltreatment, you can reverse pathogenic care, but you have to understand what you're doing. And that's a lot of our job when we work with these folks. We know a lot about helping maltreated kids because they all have certain commonalities that we see in almost all maltreated kids. Oops. And almost all kids coming into foster care have had early onset trauma. There are very few kids who have a great 8, 9 first years of their life because mom is fine and dandy, and then all of a sudden everything falls apart. It doesn't usually happen like that. More than likely, you will find, if you look back in the early histories of these kids, that something has happened to them in the early years of their life. So we really take a deep dive into that 0 to 5, and we train our therapist on working with 0 to 5 and learning what has happened to these kids and how it has affected them. Most of these kids have been separated multiple times from their caregivers. And as we have said about foster care, it is an imperfect solution to a very imperfect problem, and it results in multiple placements. I think we're going to talk about the family that I always put up the picture of the 4 little boys who had multiple placements. And the other thing that most maltreated kids have in common is the child welfare systems, by their nature, are chaotic. For those of you who are working, well, you're all working in local child welfare systems right now. We don't have any, well, we have Shanteria. Shanteria is on the West Coast. The West Coast has gone through an extreme amount of chaos in the child welfare systems in the years that we've been over there. We first went over there, it was Youth and Family Services who was taking care of the whole child welfare contract over there. And then they lost it, it went to Eckert, then Eckert lost it. It's in the last few years, it's gone from YFA to Eckert to Directions for Living to Lutheran Services. There was one in between there that I can't remember. But what's resulted over there is that it's not clear care. As with anything, case managers come and go, supervisors come and go. The way that the case management agencies are run changes because it is a difficult system. And if you have ever been a child care worker, if you've ever been a dependency case manager, it's a very, very hard job. So probably the shelf life of most case managers is less than 3 years. If you think about the case managers that you have worked with, they're young. Most of these folks, this is their first job out of college. They are more than likely going to be either young and in that stage of their life where they're getting married and having children, and they're trying to take care of their own children and trying to take care of children in their care. It's a very difficult job, and it results in a lot of chaos. So what does that mean for maltreated kids who've already had disruptions? They continue to have disruptions along the way. They continue to have bad decisions that get made as a result of the chaos. The case that I mentioned where the sibling group of 3 went to the aunt, those children never should have gone there. They didn't know this person. I don't know what her thought process was when she didn't want to have visits with them. But that was a case where I could see maybe a good GAL on that case saying, maybe this isn't the right thing to do, or maybe we need to enforce visitation. The system itself engenders chaos. So all of our maltreated kids have all of this in common. And I wish it didn't. I've been doing this work. I think the first job I had in child welfare was in 1974. And it was in upstate New York. It was a very rural area. I can think of some of the things that happened. And I'd like to say that those things don't happen anymore, but they do. We make bad placements. We let people become foster parents for the wrong reasons. We don't support the foster parents who are in it for the right reasons, and then they leave. So I'd like to say it's improved over the years, and probably it has to some degree, but it's still chaotic. And anybody who's worked in any other state in a child welfare system can probably attest that some are better than others, but they all have their endemic problems. So what do we know about the effects of trauma on kids? We absolutely know now that early trauma affects brain development. If you looked at the CAT scan of a brain of a normal 3-year-old raised in normal circumstances, and then the brain of a 3-year-old raised in pathogenic care, you would see a huge difference. You would see areas of the brain that did not develop. Think about the first 3 years of your life, your brain is wired to develop, but if there's no, it relies on caretaking. And if you're separated from your caretakers in those early years, it's going to affect your brain development. One of the things that we say when we do our 0 to 5 training here is that there's a saying in infant care that there's no such thing as a baby. There's only a baby and someone, because a baby can't survive on its own, can it? A baby cannot do anything for itself. So there's no such thing as a baby. The baby has to have someone, and it is that someone that helps that baby's brain develop. And our kids just don't, sometimes they just don't have a someone. Cells that fire together, wire together, is Donald Hebb's saying. He was an early infant child psychologist in the field, and he really preached that babies develop through their caretakers. And when we say cells that fire together, wire together, we mean that caretaker is helping that baby's developing brain. And without that caretaker, with a caretaker who's on opioids, with a caretaker who is drunk, with a caretaker who is mentally not there, those children are not receiving care.
Human brain is a wondrous machine. Literally from birth, our brains are exploring, reacting, and mirroring the world around us. A mother's loving eyes, a soft caress, a gentle, comforting voice. With every interaction, every experience, our brain creates connections. Respected researchers say our brains are sculpted by our early experiences. When those experiences are positive, in nurturing and responsive relationships, we flourish. But when early experiences are stressful, fearful, or traumatic, things can go terribly wrong.
Trauma harms the brain. This is not a software issue. This is a hardware issue.
In this video, we hope to deepen your understanding of how fear and stress and various types of trauma undermine the structure, the wiring, and the chemistry of a child's brain, putting the child at risk for a lifetime of social, learning, and behavioral problems. This is good information for anyone who cares for a child with a history of trauma, but it's crucial for parents of adopted and foster children, the vast majority of whom have suffered some kind of early harm. We'll help you understand how altered brain development can trigger what looks like bad behavior. You'll learn there's a big difference between won't and can't behaviors in fragile children. whose brains were formed under stress and fear.
We understand that these behaviors are so perplexing and confusing and sometimes even maddening, but there's great hope. And we're here to explain to you what science knows about how to change the chemistry of fear in your child to a chemistry of competency.
Just as trauma harms the brain, research shows positive experiences in trusting relationships can heal the brain.
Is there any chance I could trade you a hug?
That concept is at the core of a unique holistic intervention
And I wondered if you
created by Dr. Karen Purvis and her colleague, Dr. David Cross, at the TCU Institute of Child Development. A developmental psychologist and best-selling author, Dr. Purvis is an internationally recognized leader in the field of post-adoption care, who has devoted her life to helping children with histories of trauma.
You have a lot of things that hurt, don't you?
She calls them children from hard places. Based on more than a decade of research, Doctors Purvis and Cross have developed a program called TBRI, or Trust-Based Relational Intervention. It's about empowering parents and caregivers to help children overcome the impact of trauma
How you feeling?
and reach their full potential. It all starts with building trust.
The phenomenal thing about a trust-based intervention is
What would you like?
as we connect to this child, as we build safety, as we let them know they're precious, we actually change the brain chemistry. We've documented this and published it in numerous journals. Not only chemistry, we change the wiring of brain. We change the development of the brain. For that child whose history took him far off course, we know how to bring them back.
As recently as the 1980s, scientists believed a child's brain at birth was fairly static, largely predetermined by genetics. Researchers now know that's not true. While genetics clearly play a role, scientists know that relationships and experiences shape the brain. Think of a developing brain like a multi-storied house under construction. In this chapter, we'll explore the basics of brain development and help you understand how early traumatic experiences can design a different house. When we're born, our brains are teeming with more than 100 billion neurons or brain cells. Under optimal conditions, when our needs are met consistently by nurturing caregivers, our brains thrive. These neurons connect in complex and vast networks, much like the electrical wiring in a modern home.
The baby comes with all this wiring, but it's the human interaction, looking into the eyes, being held, hearing the song of my mother, feeling the strong shoulder of my daddy, that began to make the brain develop in very, very important ways for all of the life skills that will come.
At birth, the lower floors, or the downstairs part of the brain, is firmly wired in place by genetics, allowing a child to breathe, eat, sleep, and hear. Survival functions are rooted here. Very few connections in the upper floors are formed. These more sophisticated parts of the brain govern higher functions: complex thought, reasoning, emotional processing, memory, speech, most importantly, the ability to regulate our behavior. It takes time and repeated experiences for this circuitry to develop and become hardwired in the brain. When a child experiences trauma, abuse, neglect, or other risk factors, it can skew the wiring of the brain, as well as the structure and the chemistry. The lower, more primitive survival part of the brain can overdevelop from reacting to fear, while the critical upper floors may underdevelop and suffer.
In the book that I wrote with Dan Siegel, The Whole Brain Child, we talk about an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. For some kids,
Dr. Bryson is a psychotherapist at Pediatric and Adolescent Psychology Associates, Director of Parenting Education for the Mindsight Institute in California, and best-selling author along with Mindsight Executive Director, Dr. Dan Siegel.
the upstairs brain is the more sophisticated part of the brain. It's our cortex that takes a long, long time to develop. And it's the part of the brain that allows us to regulate our emotions and calm down our bodies, understand ourselves, understand other people, and really be able to make good choices and be flexible and adaptive. The downstairs brain is much more primitive. It's actually really well developed at birth, and it's the limbic area and the brainstem connected to the body. And that part of the brain is much more reactive, and its job is to kind of constantly be watching for how to keep us alive.
Dr. Bryson's research and studies in attachment science, child rearing theory, and interpersonal neurobiology have made her a sought-after expert contributor with appearances on Good Morning America, PBS, and Red Book magazine. She says trauma triggers the watchdog part of the lower brain, called the amygdala, to work overtime.
And its job is to constantly sort of scan the environment, to be paranoid a little bit, to be watching, is everything okay here? Am I okay? Am I safe? Is anyone out to get me? Can I relax? And that part of the brain is always appraising what's going on around us, reading faces, reading the environment.
You like bubblegum? Yeah.
No.
When children feel threatened or overwhelmed with fear, they may fight, run away, or shut down. The brain kicks into survival response, which researchers call fight, flight, or freeze survival mode. If the brain stays in this state too long because of trauma, it reorganizes around survival at the expense of healthy development of other parts of the brain.
So for a child who's had repeated exposure to fearful experiences, whether those be sort of a trauma like a car accident, or whether it's developmental or relational trauma, where the caregiver was frightening, or they were left for long periods of time to manage their own fear states, the downstairs brain has gotten a lot of practice being active. It's the repeated experiences that we have that actually activate growth and connection in the brain. So if a child has had a lot of experiences where their downstairs brain that was reactive and fearful, that part of the brain gets really well developed. Whereas then the upstairs brain that knows how to calm that fear and kind of do that self-soothing, like, oh, that was a scary noise, but I'm okay now. That part of the brain may not be as well developed in children who have had repeated fearful experiences.
Even though our brains can seem like computers hardwired into complicated networks, they are not machines. The brain is a living, growing organ. As Dr. Bryson explains, it has an enormous capacity for change.
One of the biggest fears that parents have is that they've already messed up, or that their child has sort of been wired in their brain in a way that is going to be terrible for the rest of their lives. But what's really exciting, and what we know from the studies on neuroplasticity, is that the brain is so open to change. And what's so great about that is that when we have different experiences, the brain changes in response to those experiences.
Remember, repeated experiences shape the brain. Brains of children from hard places were formed by stress and fear, from unmet needs and harmful experiences.
Can you remember, use your big voice if you need me, right? Can you show me? Mommy! There you go, and I'll come right away, okay?
You have the opportunity to reshape your child's brain
Thank you. You're welcome.
through nurturing repeated positive experiences, the basis of attachment.
Okay, I'm gonna put the screen down for a minute. I'm very fond of that video for a lot of reasons, but Karen Purvis, I think I've shown you some clips of Karen Purvis before, and as I said, she passed away a few years ago. We really lost a brilliant mind too soon, but she created TBRI, if you're familiar with trust-based relational interventions. A lot of the group homes, a lot of the child care centers use that modality of treatment. And it is really basically based on kindness, on being kind and nurturing and safe with children. And it sounds very simplistic because it isn't simplistic. She developed a really scientific based model on what happens to the child's brain with repeated interventions of a positive nature over time. The message that I think you all need to get from this and take to adoptive parents or foster parents is that, as Tina Bryson says, the brain can rebuild. The brain is a very flexible, fixable organism. And if you adopt a child who has had some really significant trust issues because of early trauma, that child can rebuild. That child's brain can learn how to adapt and how to trust. However, it takes time. And time is something that adoptive parents are short on. They want things to happen right away. They want these kids to get better right away. And it's frustrating when that doesn't happen. So as she was talking, or as you were listening to some of what was going on here, when you talk about our kids in foster care with repeated trauma, did any of that resonate with you when they talked about kids not being able to calm down? I mean, how does that manifest?
Definitely for me when I had 2 teenage girls, because they were just, I mean, 13 and 15, and they'd been through trauma all their life.
Mhm.
And so they had emotional issues. They had mental health issues. They definitely had PTSD stuff. So,
And the older they are, the harder it is to turn it around. It doesn't mean you can't turn it around. Rebecca, I'm going to ask you to speak louder than you normally do.
Okay.
Rebecca they're nine?
Yeah, the twins, yeah.
9-year-old
Yes.
twins. But just tell the group what happened to your identified twin.
Oh, okay, so what happened most recently? 'Cause it's been
Right.
going on. So,
Because your incident before it was quite detailed.
okay, so grandma, so this has been going on for weeks where grandma's calling me and saying like, I'm gonna take her to the hospital, I can't control her, but just on Friday, she lost it at the house, according to grandma. She started kicking and biting her and grandma's daughter, her aunt. And then if I remember correctly, she was tearing up paper and eating it, and then she started trying to chew plastic. And then she went upstairs. I don't know if I'm skipping something, but I know she took all like every bed in the house.
So she took the beds apart.
She took the sheets off the beds and threw the sheets all over the house. And then she took some kind of hair product and poured it on the well, she tore the mattress protectors, like tore them. I was like, what kind of mattress protectors are they? Because those are hard to tear. But she tore them, and she then poured the hair product on them. And I was asking grandma, like, well, what? So obviously that didn't go on forever, because she ended up, so she called UBC, which is a mental hospital in Orlando, that night. And she asked for advice, I guess, and they advised her to come in. She didn't go in. So actually that was Wednesday. She didn't go in until Friday, which is weird.
Right.
So I was asking grandma what de-escalated it, what happened, and she was just like, it just stopped after a while. But the weird thing is, she said that the child was just sitting,
Right.
staring straight ahead, and grandma was saying her name, and she walked to either side of her, and her eyes weren't following her.
She was dissociating.
Yeah, and so when I asked the child about it, she said it takes her a minute. Grandma made it sound like she was sitting like that for an hour. But they diagnosed her with disruptive mood dysregulation disorder.
Well, and here we go. This is a 9-year-old
Yeah.
kid. She's a twin. And what Rebecca was describing in her incident report was that the kid completely blew up and kind of pretty much destroyed the house. Physically destroyed the house, did kind of wanton destruction, and then calmed down. She probably didn't calm down. She probably was dissociating. And that's, we see that a lot with the kids like at Florida United, when those kids have these escalating blowups. They then often, and because I've watched some of these on the video after this happens, the kids will often just kind of go off in a corner and kind of go down. And when we talk about the effects of trauma, and she's in the video talking about the lower portion of the house being well developed and the upper portion being not developed at all. That's really what happens, is that the lower portion of the brain, the amygdala, is where the fear center is, and the fear center gets activated. There's no rational thought there. I doubt that Rebecca's child was saying, let me see if I can rip this mattress protector off this bed and throw some hair gel on it. Because she probably, if you sat with her, would not be able to tell you exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And that's usually what happens with kids who have these blow-ups and then try to calm down. And that is why so often I'll say to the childcare staff, don't say calm down while they're breaking all the windows, because they're not going to, quote, calm down. You almost just have to let this run its course. And then when the amygdala has settled down and maybe the thinking center has come back on again, you can then talk to a child and you can try to reason with a child, try to figure out what happened. This is a child that Rebecca's talking about that's living with a grandparent. And the grandparent is ill-equipped to try to understand how to help this little girl when she blows up. But the lack of regulation is a very common thing for kids who've been raised in traumatic circumstances. These are the kids that they're all on ADHD meds. There's probably not a kid in the world that's in foster care that isn't on an ADHD med. And is it because they're all hyperactive? It isn't. It's really because that part of their brain, the executive functioning in their brain, is not developed, and they're not able to determine how to rationally, logically think, what am I going to do now? The unfortunate thing about Rebecca's client is that she's now been given the diagnosis of what is it?
Disruptive mood dysregulation disorder.
Disruptive mood
Yeah.
dysregulation disorder,
Yeah.
DMDD, which is the one that came out in the last iteration of the DSM. And it probably does explain the physiological stuff that happens with kids that blow up. What it doesn't address, which is the criticism of this particular diagnosis, is that it doesn't address the post-traumatic stress symptoms. It doesn't address what has happened in that child's brain to disallow that child's ability to calm down. So the most common thing that we see with kids that have been raised in traumatized backgrounds is this inability to calm down. When we do our studies of the brain, we here at Circle of Friends, what we really try to tell our therapists is that, and you were seeing it in that video, that the brain stem develops first, and then the amygdala, and then this is the thinking part of your brain. The thinking part of your brain is called the prefrontal cortex. It's how we learn all of the stuff that we learn in school. We're learning through the prefrontal cortex. And again, when I talk to you about teachers have a really hard time when you try to say to them, give this kid a chance to develop their prefrontal cortex. And you will be surprised if you treat them with kindness, if you treat them with consistency, you will see that brain begin to reform and repair. And then maybe they'll do okay in school, but probably not the day you get them. That's a hard message for our teachers. And let me go back to screen share. And once again, this is the brain under stress. And when we say what really happens to the traumatized baby's brain, this is what Tina Bryson was talking about. This is the brain stem. When you're in utero, when you are a little baby floating around in your mother's amniotic sac, this is the part that's going to develop first. And we don't control anything in the brainstem. The brainstem controls breathing, pooping, peeing, just basic bodily functions. But that develops first, and we have no control over that. That's the beginning of our hardware. But this is called the amygdala. This is the fear center of the brain. And this is where all of those awful things that happen to children get stored, whether they remember them or not, they're stored in there. If you're familiar with EMDR as a treatment technique, basically, simplistically saying EMDR allows the EMDR therapist to help that child move that traumatic memory from this part to this part so that they can access it and learn that they're okay. But this is the part that is not going to get developed. This is the prefrontal cortex. It's where all your executive functioning is. And if you've had a horrible first 4 or 5 years of life, you probably haven't developed that. If you know anything, and what I say to some of the younger therapists is that we know now that the brain is not fully formed until you're about 25 years old. So if you are, and think about that for a minute, when are you getting your bachelor's degree? Usually when you're getting your bachelor's degree, you're in your early 20s, maybe you like 18 to 21 is that era where people get their bachelor's degree. And we're expecting people to come out with bachelor's degrees when they're 21 years old. And we're saying as brain doctors that your brain isn't even fully formed until you're 25. So we're expecting a lot of those teenage years. We're expecting a lot of the kids who are now in their teenage years and they've had pretty bad upbringings. We're expecting them to have normal brain development and to have a prefrontal cortex that's working okay. But if you think about the kids that you work with that are probably not doing all that great in school, because they've been moved. I mean, think about kids that are in foster care. They get moved from placement to placement. If they get moved, they have a new school, they have a new case manager, they have a new therapist, maybe they have a new daycare center. They're not able to keep up as well as the normal child. So again, for our purposes in working with adoptive parents, we always tell them, give that prefrontal cortex a little time to catch up. You can help it, but give it time before you start saying you're not getting all A's, and I know you can. And I'm not picking on teachers because teachers really do adopt a lot of our kids, but that's the conversation that we have with our teachers a lot. And this, I think this is Bruce Perry's conceptualization. If any of you are familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry, he is one of the leading neuropsychiatrists. He, along with Karen Purvis, Dan Siegel, Tina Bryson, we have a rich amount of people that have really studied the brain and learned how we as therapists can help bring it along. But this is his what is neurodevelopmental rationale for sequential enrichment. You can't even say it, but this is Dr. Perry's conceptualization of what might work at different stages along the way. And if you look at this here, which says encourage abstract thought, we don't even get to this part in our therapy until we've really had time to work with kids. These are the things that he's talking about. These things work well at different stages. These are all somatic things. These are all things that have to do with calming the child's central nervous system. When we talk about what works best for calming the limbic system or the amygdala, this is all expressive play therapy. Dancing, play therapy, art, sand tray, movement, yoga. These are the things that work well with our kids, which is why our therapists do a lot of work learning how to do all these expressive therapies, because you cannot sit down with a 10-year-old traumatized child and say, tell me about your story, kid. You've really got to work with kids first with expressive therapies, which is why we really push that a lot. So let's talk about how chronic trauma affects the ability of the brain to develop normally. Now, in order to understand this, you have to understand what happens in the first 3 years of your life. What are your tasks? What do you as a baby have to learn how to do? And very first one there is that you have to learn how to regulate your emotions. You have to, the second thing you do as a baby is you form interpersonal relationships. If there's nobody to form it with, you don't have anybody to form interpersonal relationships with. If your mother is always high, or if your father is missing, or if there's nobody in your life because you're in and out of foster care. So the main tasks of your first 3 years are to learn how to regulate your emotions, learn how to relate to other people, and to explore your environment and learn from it. Now, think about adoptive parents. Adoptive parents want their children to come into them, loving them, able to interact with them, able to trust them. Most of these kids don't have that. And the reason we go over this so much with our therapists, learning how to do adoptive work, is that understanding what has happened to that child's brain in the first 3 years of life is really, really important. Emotional development means that you have to learn as a baby to regulate your emotions and learn how to calm yourself down. And most of our kids have not had that. Does anybody know what the concept of the good enough mother is? What is the good enough mother? When I say that maybe you or I were good enough mothers or good enough fathers, what does that mean? Do you have to do everything for your kids when they're little? All right, let me give you an example. I was in a restaurant. I was waiting for somebody to come to join me for lunch, and there were 2 young mothers at a table. This is in Houlihan's or Hooligan, I think it's Houlihan's. And they each had babies in baby seats. They each had very young babies in baby seats on the table with them. And there was a 2-year-old in a high chair. And you know what it was like when you were a young mother and you kind of wanted to have a little bit of time that somebody wasn't drooling on you or spitting up on you, and you wanted to spend some time with an adult. And these 2 young mothers were sitting there, they were having a glass of wine, they were having a nice conversation, and their very little babies, of course, were sleeping, because little babies sleep mercifully about 20 hours a day. But what about 2-year-olds? 2-year-olds don't. And this 2-year-old was watching his mother, and she was trying to ignore him, and he kept hitting her and touching her and throwing things on the ground. So she put her keys on the high chair to entertain him. And he picked up the keys and threw them on the ground. So she reached down, got the keys, put them on the thing again, and went back to her friend and tried to have a conversation. The kid looked at her and said, "Oh, no, 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 I want the attention." Threw the keys on the ground again. She picks the keys up, she puts them back on the thing. Well, the 3rd time he threw the keys down, she looked at him and she turned around and she was the good enough mother. She said, "I'm done playing the keys game with you, and I'm going to talk to my friend." Well, he had to make a decision. He had to figure out what he was going to do. So he did figure out what he was going to do. He had another little toy, and once he saw that she was not going to pay any attention to him, he began to entertain himself. He began to regulate himself. And that's what we mean about the good enough mother, that was the beginning of that kid learning how to regulate himself. We all had to do it. We had to do it with our own babies. If you think about those of you who have had babies, probably the first 6 months of your baby's life, you do everything for your baby because your baby can't do anything for himself or herself. But then your baby gets to be about 8, 9 months old, and you put your baby in bed and your baby fusses, and you let the baby fuss, and you let that baby learn how to regulate himself, learn how to put himself to sleep. If you fuss in there, if you rush in there, if you meet your baby's every single physical need and every psychological need, that baby will never learn that lesson. And that's what the good enough mother is. Those of you, I don't think anybody is old enough to remember T. Barry Brazelton, but T. Barry Brazelton was a child psychologist in the 80s. And he wrote for McCall's and Red Book and all the women's magazines of the time. And he was an extremely calm person. And I went to one of his conferences in Springfield, Massachusetts. I was living up there at the time. And T. Barry Brazelton was the one who first initiated the concept that a baby can actually see. When my mother was raising me, she didn't think I could see. That was kind of the Freud and Dr. Spock and all of that thing, thinking that babies were not really people. And T. Barry Brazelton, in this particular conference, a woman was sitting in the front. She had a baby that was probably about a year old. And he asked her if he could hold that baby, and he carried that baby through the whole conference. And the baby was very calm, because anytime the baby would start to fuss, he just had this kind of sing-songy voice like Mr. Rogers. Remember Mr. Rogers? There wasn't a kid in the world that could be upset around Mr. Rogers, because he had that persona as well. But T. Barry Brazelton is probably passed away now. I really don't know, but he was in his late 80s and he was being interviewed on National Public Radio, and he talked about putting his babies to bed and sitting by their bedside and saying, "You can do it. You can put yourself to sleep. I'm going to trust you to put yourself to sleep." He was the good enough father. He was the good enough father to say, "I know you can learn how to do this. And I'm here, and I'm not going to let any harm come to you, but I'm going to let you fuss a little bit and learn how to regulate yourself." So that's what I mean when I say the good enough parent. Now think about our kids who come into foster care who have had either severely depressed caretakers or any non-existent caretakers or neglectful or abusive caretakers. They do not transition to self-regulation because nobody's taught them that. Has anybody worked with failure to thrive children? Has anybody had kids on their caseload that were failure to thrive, or do you know what failure to thrive is? You guys know what the concept of failure to thrive is with our children? You're looking blank at me, so I'm going to tell you what it is because you're not giving me any clues here. There's a physiological thing that happens to babies if they are not cared for. If you think about it, if with your own babies, if they cried, you came to them, you changed them, you fed them, you made them comfortable. But what happens if you're a baby and you cry and nobody ever comes? Do you keep crying? They don't. Failure to thrive babies do not keep crying. They stop crying. They stop reaching out for help. They stop expecting in their own baby brain that somebody is going to come and take care of them. And that is the beginning of failure to thrive. I'm not sure where it is, but I think I have a video on this training that I'm going to show you that will really show you what failure to thrive does. But failure to thrive babies, everything, all of their systems are affected by the fact that this caretaker does not pick them up and care for them. The brain stops pruning off the unneeded connections. It stops trying to build connections that say this person is going to take care of me. And failure to thrive babies stop growing. The ones that I have worked with over the years are usually way underweight. They're not developmentally where they should be. They do not learn how to do baby things like rolling over or sitting up or doing any of those things. They just stop growing. And I'm trying to think of when this was, but I think it was probably in the early 90s. I was a case manager in Westfield, Massachusetts. And we had a really it's probably one of the most bizarre cases I've ever had with failure to thrive. But there were 7 children in a family, and 3 of the children, the neighbors finally reported, and we eventually removed these kids, but they were being kept in dog cages outside of their house, and they weren't fed. Now, this is an area of the country that is cold in the winter. It's Massachusetts is in the Berkshires. It's cold in the winter. It snows. It's not, you don't want to be out in a dog cage. But when we removed all 7 of the children, the 3 children that were in the dog cages were very, very small. We thought they were, looking at them and thinking back on them now, we thought they were like 3 years old. So the 4 children that were in the house that were cared for were all normal size. And to this day, I could not tell you the why of this. But the 4 children that were in the home were normal sized children. The 3 children that were in the dog cages were all very, very small. And we took them over to Bay State Medical Center, which was a teaching hospital. And the pediatrician, the head pediatrician, wanted to study them because he wasn't 100% sure what was happening. But when we brought in the little girl that we thought was 3, she was actually 10. And we had a hard time trying to figure out how old they were because they were all so small and they were underdeveloped. They were underdeveloped psychologically, they were underdeveloped physically. And he followed them for a while. He gave it a term that I don't think is used anymore. He called it developmental dwarfism. And he kept growth charts on them, and they did eventually begin to grow, but they never reached normal size because they were so far behind. We actually, when I was over at Florida United several years ago, there was a little girl there that was failure to thrive, and she was 10, but she was about the size of a 3-year-old. So it's a really serious phenomenon. It does affect growth. We're looking at our kids that have had either neglectful or pathogenic caretakers, that they don't grow and they don't reach self-regulation. I will tell you that of that family, that those kids did catch up in terms of educational ability. They caught up in terms of developmental ability, being able to regulate and interact with people, but they never achieved normal size. And if that was the 90s, so those kids are adults now. And as a final thing I will tell you about that case, the judge on the case did not believe in developmental dwarfism because he was 4'9", and he just did not believe. He kept saying, "Are you telling me that my mother didn't take care of me, and that's why I'm so short?" He was short because he was short. But it was, when I say we've had to learn along the way, you learn from the things that you remember in your history that we didn't know anything about. We didn't know anything at that time about the way brain development and physical development is affected by lack of care. And now we do. So, and I can say that because I'm quite sure that judge has passed away too. The second thing we have to do as babies is learn how to develop consistent and stable relationships. We have to learn what we can expect of our caretakers, and neglected kids don't know what to expect from their caretakers because they don't get anything from their caretakers. If you think about some of the families that you've worked with, especially, I know Rebecca works with older kids that are impaired and probably come from a long line of pathogenic relationships. And now these kids are given diagnosis of conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder. They're placed in alternative schools where everybody looks at them as bad kids. And they're already behind the 8 ball in terms of what we can do for them. But learning how to relate is really, really important. Well, how do you learn that? You learn that because you have a consistent caretaker. And I have to say that if you are a foster parent or an adoptive parent, you can repair kids. You can teach kids that you will come when they call. But they're not going to expect it immediately. And one of the videos that we have on our YouTube channel that I was just going through it the other day, when we did the adoption series, one of the videos that we use is about detached children and talking to adoptive parents about why these kids seem so detached, and to give those kids time to learn how to catch up with the fact that you as the adoptive parent are there. You're wired to love them. You want to love them. You want them to connect with you, but it takes time for kids to realize that you are going to be there for them. And the last thing, when I talk about the things that kids have to do as babies, is that they have to learn how to communicate with their caretakers. And we have to help our babies develop the confidence that they're going to learn how to engage you. Think about if you hold a baby, you know what mirroring is? And you hold the baby and the baby's looking at you and you're making eye contact and you do like a facial expression, maybe you hold your tongue out. If you do that long enough, they're gonna do it back. And you gotta watch that with other people's kids. When you're walking through Disney, don't be making faces at other people's kids. But, and I say that with all sincerity because I had a male therapist who was loved kids. And he used to do that, and he'd be like sitting, like in the food court at McDonald's or something, and he'd see a baby and he'd start to try to engage the baby. Well, parents don't always like that if they don't know who you are. So, but babies will mirror you because they have learned how to interact with you. They've learned how to lock eyes with you, and you're doing something and they're going to do something back. Kids that have been neglected don't have that ability to interact. They haven't had anybody do it with them. So I think I'm going to show you the still face in this training. Are any of you familiar with the still face experiment?
Yes.
Rebecca's saying yes. Okay. What do you know about still face?
I've seen the video quite a few times, but, the idea is that the mom is engaging normally with the baby and they're doing the mirroring, they're going back and forth, and then all of a sudden the mom just shuts down.
Right?
And it's impressive how much she shuts down, but no emotion back and forth at all, no interaction, and the baby starts kind of panicking and trying to engage the mom.
Losing its mind, yeah.
Yeah, and then eventually, I've seen a couple different ones, but the one I'm thinking of, eventually the baby gives up. But then when the mom re-engages.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to show you the still. It's probably the one that you've
Yeah.
all seen because I think they show it mostly in graduate school
Yeah.
because it does show you that the still face experiment is meant to show you that babies who are normally engaged with their caretaker, and when that caretaker is removed from them, they react very, very strongly. Babies who are not used to interacting with their caretakers do not notice. And I wouldn't suggest that you do this experiment with any of your children on your caseload, but you probably would find if you did that they would not notice that you had stopped interacting with them. I think, let me pop ahead a little bit here so I can see where I am. Okay, how about before we get into poor Dr. Spitz here, it's 20 after. Why don't you guys take 10 minutes and do whatever you need to do in those 10 minutes, and then we'll be back.
Thank you.
Y'all dressed up for summer.
Try to. I think, most of it, that when you look over at my closet and my drawer, I said, what can I pull together that I don't have to ask? Just lie on and be comfortable and make quiet. So, some of the stuff is kind of like what I had over the years, so it's more of that. It ain't really like new stuff, but it.
I think one of the things that we find out is that people are in the house by themselves, so I don't see getting the rest of the work today.
I was still out because I was with this kid at night.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and by then, the foreign body will be paid by the state of Florida, it's like, no, y'all can't, even let them do, purchase. So when the school year ended, they did let, because we shut down in April, so they did let us do May. But then when school started back up, you know, to come back into the classroom. But only to, and they did have to have, but like, for PPK kids, what you prefer to, kindergarten, I think it was the first year. But the upper grades, I think like 1 to 5, they had these weird diets, different stuff like they had out. And they can do, the parents had a choice with the upper ages, on bringing them back, or what the smaller, from preschool up to, I think, kindergarten, they had to be in, yeah,
During that period.
yeah, so that was the deal. So you had to pull out the clothing.
I scheduled a session for 2 today because we've been done on time. Is that gonna be okay? Okay, I'm gonna call the caregiver and remind her real quick if that's okay.
You know, the thing is, this used to last till 4.
Yeah.
We don't, I used to have to give people an hour for lunch.
yeah, right,
and They're in front of me, we don't talk.
yeah, yeah. Okay, I'm gonna call her real quick because it's a foster home and I just got 2 new clients in that home. So I'm gonna call her. And
I heard about that, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask her if it's okay if I come see the new clients next week as well. So let me call her real quick.
Oh, God.
Can I use that office?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's, I have there.
Yeah, figured it was lunch.
Question. An attorney from the GAL's office called for one of Janet's cases. She wanted to ask just a basic question to Janet. If the client that Janet has can be deposed. I told her that, yeah, I told her that, we would need a release of information from this, because the sister is the legal guardian. And she said, fine, because I didn't know, because I was like, we never got a question, I've never gotten a question like that directly.
They don't depose too much anymore. They usually just bring them.
Right, so I didn't know, but she wanted to know, the question was, did she think the child was capable of sitting through that? And I'm like,
And Janet, who's never seen the child,
well, Janet sees the kid,
but she's.
but, right, so I'm like, I was like, look, I said, one, I need to verify your credentials, I don't even know if you can tell me you're an attorney, I don't know who you are. I said, but, we would need to release the information, so I just emailed Janet and gave her a heads up that if somebody calls, to let her know. I said she could speak to the GAL without a problem, but not an attorney.
Yeah, nobody's ever asked this question before.
Right, they usually, and I was like, if you wanna speak to Janet, you would have to subpoena, and she was like, well, it's not she was like, it's not something that's like, it's not a legal question, it's just
They never,
well,
that's all, I always have trouble in jail. Because they, like Dina just got. Dina just got to be- and it's Dina who's the attorney who said, "He's free." And they said, no, he's got to go, he's got to get her ready, he's got to pay for it. But. I don't think they would know better. I would think they would too, but.
right, because when she first goes,
But I have two examples. Yeah. On that, she had like all these questions, and I think in a while we shut it down. But it's also that, oh, she got the words, that's all like, yeah, I'm not. We really like that. Yeah.
yeah.
No, I had to leave a voicemail. I'm trying to make sure like I can go again because she just wants telehealth, but now I have 3 kids in the home.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, but last week, I'm worried it's happening again because last week I started the Zoom session and I called. I texted that morning to remind her and she didn't respond. And then I called at 2:05 when they didn't get on the Zoom session and she didn't answer. And then I left the Zoom session up for until like 2:15 and nothing. And then at 4, I see right here, she texted me at 4, not sure what happened, but let's reconnect. But I just get the feeling that she's like,
I was gonna say, she sounds resistant.
yeah, but it's the caregiver, not the client. But the client doesn't have, like she wants all communication to go through her, like she's a caregiver, so I have to.
How old's the kid?
14.
Mm.
It's iffy because like Charlotte, her mom, but I told you about kind of a weird situation. Her mom is fine with me, and Megan is also 14, and both of those caregivers are allowing me to just communicate with the client at 14. But easier. It is. But yeah, I have no way to get in touch with the client. So
That's, you're gonna, when you have resistant caretakers, it is difficult.
yeah.
I've got so much stuff on this table. All this stuff belongs to me. Okay, are we ready to get going?
Yeah, you forgot to turn off the recording.
Oh, see, I need somebody to help me. I do not remember to do that. But you know what happens when you look at what you have recorded, if you stop talking for a while, it kind of shuts itself off. And then when you start talking again, it seems to pick it up. You have a little episode in there where nobody's doing anything, and then it kind of comes back again. I probably could edit it, but I don't know how to, so. Okay. We're going to continue to talk about the effect that pathogenic care has on attachment. And when we have little ones, when we're working with kids who had these experiences when they were little, and by little, I'm talking about probably pre-verbal. Most kids start to develop some cognitive awareness through language when they're maybe about 3. But when we get these kids, when we get our clients trying to kids who don't remember what happened to them, they can't remember what happened. We're trying to figure out what happened. Sometimes the CBHA will give us a good history and we'll know that this is what happened in the early years. But sometimes we just have to try to look at the history and we try to connect the dots in kids' lives. We certainly can safely assume that if it looks like early removal happens sometime in the first 5 years of life, that there has been disruption in attachment. And we now know what that looks like. We know what these kids look like, what they haven't been able to do, what they haven't been able to develop. They haven't been able to regulate their emotions. They haven't been able to learn how to interact intimately with somebody who's going to meet their needs. They haven't learned how to, I don't think I even got to this part. What's the other thing that a baby needs to learn for good health? The baby needs to learn how to get out into the environment, explore the environment, and then come back to a safe place. And that's a circle of security. That's that method of treatment. But basically, it just means that if you think about your own kids or kids that maybe you cared for, we have to teach children that it is safe to go out into the world and then come back, because I, as the caretaker, am always going to be there. Now, what happens when kids don't have that safe place to retreat, come back to, is that sometimes they don't go out at all. Or sometimes they go out and don't come back because there's nobody there waiting for them to ensure safety. One of the things that I have always seen working with kids, especially in group homes or foster care, is that with this history of early pathogenic care, kids often do not learn that they don't learn to think about safety. They don't learn to think logically. They don't learn that no matter what I do, there will be that person waiting for me, and it's okay for me to explore because I can come back. We often see these kids getting hurt. We often see these kids getting in trouble, not understanding what is safe to do because they haven't learned that safety. So we have to try to connect the dots with these kids and try to figure out what experiences they might have had. But if you were looking at a CBHA or an assessment, what might you be looking for to say, these are the red flags in this kid's early history? Almost all these things are red flags in a child's early history, and we find them in almost all kids that are in foster care. Very young parents, it's often a common denominator with a lot of these kids that the parents are young. And often we're talking about intergenerational, that this is not the first generation that's had issues like this, but we're talking about young parents. We're often talking about a lack of prenatal care and that prenatal history of substance abuse. But think about that from the perspective of a pregnant teenager or a pregnant young woman who might be abusing substances. Why would they not get prenatal care? There's a pretty common reason that they don't get prenatal care.
Well, they don't want to take a urine specimen.
Exactly. That's the bottom line. When you go in for your monthly, you have to give a urine sample. They're going to check for a variety of markers in the urine. And if you're a young parent and you are abusing, you don't want that to show up. Very often, when I'm reading the CBHAs, we do CBHAs here, and I'll read the history, and you very often will see that there's been no prenatal care. With the kids that are coming into us, we do, for the kids that are under 6, we do what's called an in-depth assessment. And the in-depth assessment really looks at the birth history. When did the mom find out she was pregnant? Was it a surprise? Was she using before she found out? Was she using after she found out? How much is that child affected at birth? Was that child affected at birth? An awful lot of our kids coming into care now have had in utero substance abuse. A lot of them end up in the NICU. And think about that, even for a young baby in the NICU. And I know that the nurses do the best they can. And I know that there are a lot of volunteers who come in and try to do skin to skin and try to nurture. But that's a hard start for a child's life, to be in the NICU, especially with parents that are not coming in to be with that child. What are red flags? We're going to see separation in the first year. We're going to see parents that are absent, missing, incarcerated. Maybe they've died of substance abuse. Almost all of our kids have, I call it the trifecta: substance abuse, domestic violence, poverty. Almost all of this is the children that are coming in to our care have had almost all of these issues. And the reason that we have developmental delays in kids in the early years of their life is not because they're not wired to learn. It's because they've had so many interruptions with caregivers along the way that those lessons and those markers aren't learned. We also see a lot of speech delays. Do anybody want to venture a guess why these kids have speech delays? Is it because they can't speak?
No one spoke to them to teach them.
That's exactly right. If you, well, we do supervised visitation here. We do therapeutic visitation. But one of the earlier cases that we had at Circle of Friends, I took the visitation myself. And it was 4 little boys, and they hadn't seen their mother for maybe 9 months. And they came in to the visit in the visitation center. And she started out pretty good. She came in, she had Happy Meals for all of them. They ranged in age from like 3 to 9 at the time. And she had Happy Meals for them. And then she asked them all what size shoe they wore. And she wrote it very carefully down in a little notebook. And then for the next 2 hours, she didn't say another word to them. She sat there, she watched them play. They were not used to her talking to them. So they didn't pay much attention. They did what they normally did. The older boy began to organize play for the younger ones. The 2 older children tried to nurture the 2 babies, but they weren't used to her talking to them, and she didn't talk to them. And when it was time for her to leave, usually in visitation, we would give the kids like a 15-minute warning and say, Mom's going to have to leave here when the big hand is on this, and show them the clock, and Mom will be going then. And I did that with them, but they didn't even notice when she left because they weren't used to her taking the time to talk to them. And to be fair to her, she had had no upbringing herself. Her father was in prison for life for a murder, and her mother was dead. So this was someone who had no caretaking and passed that lack of caretaking along to her children. But we often see kids with speech delays and developmental delays, and it isn't because they are developmentally subpar. It's just because no one has developed with them. And I just put these 4 pictures up because these are all significant events in the first 5 years of life. You're looking at a very young parent, and look at what this girl is doing. Is she paying attention to the baby? She's got the bottle in the baby's mouth. She's writing something. She's not paying a whole lot of attention. When you're feeding your baby, it is a really significant time when you are holding your baby, you're looking at your baby, you're making eye contact with your baby, maybe you're cooing with your baby, you're talking to your baby.
Stop.
What's the matter, Charmaine?
I don't have a picture. Up. What? Gotta go back in the link.
Hold on, Charmaine is experiencing a difficulty. Did you
Yeah, I
lose your?
can hear you. I don't see anybody anymore. I don't know what happened. My dog's barking at me and wait, let me hit the zoom down here.
Why
Okay.
don't
Okay, I've got here, but I don't know why I'm on the big screen and I can't see what you're viewing. So what do I need to do? Just go out and come back in?
I would go out and come back in again. I think that's usually your best option. Usually it will pop you right back into where you need to be.
All right.
All right, let's give her a minute to do that. I couldn't tell if she was yelling at the dog.
I know, I was like, wait, what?
What was happening there?
Yeah,
We'll give her a minute.
I think she entered, it looks like she entered the waiting room.
Yeah, she's back.
Now I can see it.
Okay, well, we don't know what the dog did, but we have had, since we've all had to go to Zoom, we have had lots of problems with pets disconnecting our boards. So, um, okay, she's back. What I was saying when your dog interrupted us is that when you're holding your baby and you're feeding your baby, it's an optimum time to make eye contact, to coo. The whole act of feeding a baby is a very connecting, interacting experience. Does this young mother pay any attention to her baby? She's not paying attention to her baby. We have a lot of young
On her
mothers.
cell phone.
Right, exactly. We have a lot of difficulties with having to teach young parents that this is a time for you to interact with your baby, not to be texting, not to be doing something else, but trying to pay attention to your baby. This is that kind of lack of connection that we see with, again, with very young parents, very inexperienced parents, or parents who were neglected and abused themselves. Because we always say you cannot give what you have not received yourself. Depression, sadness, substance abuse, these are all difficulties with young parents. And I put this picture up here because I think we far underestimate the effect that deployment has on our military families. And we see that a lot. If you ever look on YouTube, and there are all these little videos of heartwarming YouTube videos of people coming back from deployment and reconnecting with their children or surprising their children at a daycare center or whatever, I find them heartbreaking because the children are so affected by the parent finally coming back home. The parent is so affected. You look at fathers who come home who've never met the baby that the wife is holding, waiting for him to come home. We have not given the amount of import that we need to give to what happens to families when parents are deployed. And in recent years, we've had mothers deployed, which we didn't used to have to quite the same degree. And there was a picture in the paper one time when I was looking at it of this mother was being deployed to Afghanistan, I think, and she had a 2-month-old baby. And of course, that's going to affect both the baby and the mother. No matter what we try to do with our technology, with FaceTiming and all the things that we try to do, there is still a physiological separation of that mother from that baby that's going to affect the baby's attachment. Not to say that loving fathers and grandparents can't step in, they can, but I find it difficult when young mothers are asked to separate from their very young children. So how are kids going to be affected by early abuse? When I say the pre-verbal kids store implicit memory, they do. Implicit memories are things that we don't have language for. If you've had something happen to you as a very young child and you don't have a cognitive memory of it, but something triggers you, and triggering is something that happens with our kids a lot. That kids get triggered by certain things and we don't understand why they're being triggered by them, but it's connecting something in their pre-verbal memory. When I always put the hot sauce baby up here because I need to remember to tell you the story, but we had a very young child. Actually, it was a sibling group of two, and the 4-year-old was our client. It was, I believe, a semi-foster home, but the 2-month-old baby had been severely abused by the father. I don't have any backstory to that or why he did it. But when the 2-month-old baby was brought into the emergency room, there were several fractures and different stages of healing. And the baby was placed with the grandmother. And the grandmother was very nurturing. It took her a while. She said the baby would try to pull away from her. The baby was afraid of her touch. Well, and the baby also had some injuries that needed to heal. But one of the days that the therapist was at this grandmother's home, the grandmother had the baby in the high chair. And the baby is now maybe 6, 7 months old, but the baby was doing much better. And the baby was relaxed around her. He would smile around her. But she had made tacos that day, and she leaned over the baby to get something, and the baby started screaming. And the baby had not been screaming. And the 4-year-old said to the therapist, "Daddy put hot sauce in the baby's mouth." The daddy, for whatever reason, put hot sauce on the end of the diaper and would force it into the baby's mouth. So the baby smelled the hot sauce, and the baby was triggered by the hot sauce. One of the things that we tried to say to the grandma, number one, don't make tacos around this baby. But that is an implicit memory. He has no language for it. He just knows that something happened and his sense of smell activated a trigger, and probably always will. It doesn't mean that as that child gets older, you can't say, you're probably going to have a bad reaction to hot sauce, and maybe this is why, so maybe you should avoid it. But implicit memories are triggered by usually sensory, something smelling, something touching, something that they hear, and we have to be aware of that as we're working with our kids. When I say pre-verbal, I want you to think about what your first memory is. Most of our first memories maybe start when we're around 3. And sometimes people will say, well, I broke my arm when I was 18 months old. I did have somebody tell me that once. They broke their arm when they were 18 months old and they remembered that. And I said, are you sure you remembered it? Because the big brother kept saying, when you were 18 months old, you broke your arm. And that's always what happens is that maybe your older siblings are going to give you those memories, but you don't really have them. Most of us do not have memories until we have language associated with it. And that's how we cognitively pull up those memories. But pre-verbal kids are going to store a lot of trauma in that implicit memory, and they're not always going to know what it is. So that's why we try to say to adoptive parents, if you know that every time you try to brush your daughter's hair that she screams, then she's triggering something, and just to learn how to be sensitive around those issues. Okay, I'm going to show you a video. My therapists are really sick of looking at this video, and they kind of tell me to stop showing it, but I do keep showing it because it is a really, really good example of what happens when you do not have caretaking. This was a research study done in 1952 by Dr. Renee Spitz. And Renee Spitz was a friend of Sigmund Freud's, and he wanted to study what happened to the orphans of World War II. If you know anything about the history of World War II, European cities and countries were decimated during the war. 50% of Hungary was destroyed, 80% of Germany was destroyed. There was destruction on a level that we didn't have in the United States. And many of young children were left in the rubble, and they were put in orphanages because that's what they had. There weren't a lot of adults. A lot of the adults have been killed. These children were put in orphanages and they were warehoused because there weren't enough people to take care of them. It wasn't that these people were unkind or uncaring, there weren't enough of them. So the staff infant ratio in those orphanages at the time was about 1 caretaker for 50 children. And Dr. Spitz wanted to know how this was going to affect the growth and development and emotional development of children. So he conducted a research study. And I'm going to show it to you. It's 7 minutes long. It's really hard to watch, but the good news is that his work really did put an end to the warehousing of children, and it was the beginning of the foster care system. And as much as we think that the foster care system has its problems, warehousing kids in orphanages with no caretakers had a lot more problems. So there is no sound. I want you to look at these kids, and when it tells you how old they were, I want you to look at them and see what the effects of lack of care has had on them. And again, this was done in 1952. Not all of his findings were sound, but most of them were. I want you to tell me when this is done, what you notice about these kids. She's going to poke this kid in the head with a pencil to see if she can get the kid to pay attention to her. That last sentence was not founded. But I think what he was looking at was just, they were just not able to develop. Now, this child is supposed to be 9 months old, and it was brought into the orphanage when it was 3 months old. That poor little guy just breaks my heart.
Yeah. He can't even turn over.
Right, then they don't develop. I also notice that there's a cameraman standing right over these children, and they are not reacting to that person at all.
Mhm.
I also noticed that there's absolutely nothing in these cribs for these kids to play with.
Mm.
And this child is 10 months old. Also came into this orphanage when he was 3 months old.
Very tiny.
Yeah. They pretty much have nothing but their hands and feet to play with,
But they're not even looking at them.
right?
I don't understand why they can't see. I mean, babies see at birth.
I think they can see. There's just nothing for them to look at. And there's nothing for them to connect with because there's no adults.
Okay, but one of the things he said is they don't see.
Well, and I think that was one of his findings that was not founded.
Oh, okay. You said those all were not founded.
His conclusion was that they could basically not do anything.
Yeah.
But they certainly couldn't do what a 10-month-old child should be able to do.
Oh, yeah.
There actually is more of this on YouTube if you want to subject yourself to more of this.
Mm. Mm.
I don't know if you could read that, but basically he said that many of them died by the time they were 2.
Oh, my.
That's so sad.
Now you can see why my therapists keep telling me to stop showing this video to them.
Yeah, because we'd want to all go rescue them.
Right. You know, and I know it's hard to watch it, but what did you notice about those kids besides their size? Facial expression?
Yeah, the one that was laying in the crib also like never like picked its head up when the lady was like trying to get its attention.
I know that is a sad segment. I think that was a little girl. Um, and I think what they were trying to show is that they had, well, for one thing, if you're in bed in a hospital for a while, you lose muscle tone,
Right.
you lose a lot of your strength. These kids were pretty much in cribs. They had, if you notice, there were no toys or things in the cribs with them. And that was probably at a time before we didn't think we should put anything in a crib with a baby. Um, they didn't gain weight. They didn't meet developmental milestones, which is why you saw that little baby rocking. That at 10 months old, surely that child should have been almost walking and he couldn't roll over.
Mhm.
But beyond that, what about their facial expressions? There's cameramen standing right over them taking these pictures.
Expressions.
They're the very first kid is probably the oldest little boy in the whole thing. So he's been there for the longest. He looked like he was maybe 2. But he has absolutely no facial expressions at all. There's no, if you sat in front of a normal baby that's 2 months old and you started to make faces or you started to mirror, that baby would connect with you. These were not children that connected with anything. And many of them did die. And they didn't die because they were sick. It's really hard sometimes to understand that lack of care can lead to death. If you know anything about the turn of the century in New York City, when people were living in tenements and there was absolutely no expectation of treating children well, many of those children who came in with parents who died from illnesses, the plague or whatever, ended up in an orphanage on Ellis Island. And 50% of those children died before they were 2 years old. And when you look at the death records, it lists things like, why did this child die? This child died from a cold. This child died from a flu. This child died from an allergy. Not things that would kill children, but without any kind of care, kids stop growing and many of them die. And if you don't think that you're important to your kids, you are, because I show this mostly because it's brutal to watch, but it really does show you what happens with early deprivation. I mean, these kids had nothing at all, but a lot of the kids that we are working with have not had a lot of good care in the early years of their life. And what we want adoptive parents to understand is that they can remediate this. That's always the positive message you have to give. You can't hit them over the head with this and don't show them this video, but you really have to be able to say to adoptive parents, you can turn this around. It's going to take time. You're going to have to be consistent. You're going to have to be patient, but you can turn this around because you are there making eye contact, touching, trying to help kids to understand that you're there to take care of them. Some of these studies on early deprivation, we still see it, and when we talk about, we're not going to go into international adoptions too much, but one of the difficulties with the international adoptions, depending on what country they come from, is that a lot of kids in some of the less developed countries are still being warehoused in orphanages. And then you go over there because you think it's easier to get a child from the Ukraine or Nigeria or whatever, and you bring these kids home and they've had absolutely nothing and they have not learned how to connect with you. And before we started really getting into the science of what happened to kids with lack of care, because I was doing private practice in the 90s before we had the wisdom of knowledge of some of this stuff, that we would have people come in and say, well, you know, I adopted this baby from China when he was 2 months old, and now he's 7 and he's incorrigible. He won't listen to me. He won't talk to me. He won't do anything. We didn't have that knowledge of, well, that's probably what's happened here, and this is how we can help. We kind of had to fly by the seat of our pants. So I want you guys to have the knowledge so that you have a scientific basis for what you're saying to these parents, is that you can fix this and you can turn this around. We absolutely know now that the caretaker child interaction is what shapes that baby's brain. But if you lose that caretaker, it's going to have a neurological effect on you as a baby, and it's going to have an emotional effect on you. The whole thing about when a baby's brain, when a baby is born, they have millions of connections in their brain. They don't need them all. So as you as the caretaker are caretaking them and teaching them trust and teaching them interaction, a lot of the unnecessary connections begin to drop away in the brain. And then the brain ends up with what it needs to be a functioning, interactive, emotionally connected adult. But without that caretaking, those things don't happen. So, and again, I always say, if you don't think you're important to your kids, you are. One of the times I did this training, it was before the pandemic, when people came in, and I had a whole room full of people who were all mothers, and we had this I showed them the Spitz video, and we were talking about how important it is to connect with your kids. And because I had a room full of therapists, they immediately all decided that they were inadequate caretakers and their kids were not connected to them. So I had to stop and say, no, wait a minute, I'm not, don't blame yourselves for some of the things that you do. I'm sure you're connected to your children. But that video has had more than one person question their sanity, so I hope that didn't happen to you. But when we say that attachment is everything, timing is everything. Your brain is going to develop to 85% if it's adult size in the first 3 years of your life. So really, in the first 3 years of life, most of what you need to learn to function in your lifetime, you learn in the first 3 years of life. If you think about what happens in the first year of life, those kids that you saw who couldn't even roll over, in the first year of life, there's a tremendous amount of development that happens in that little baby body. They learn how to hold their head up. They learn how to roll over. They learn how to sit up. They learn how to crawl. They learn how to walk. They learn how to talk. That's a lot of stuff in 1 year. And when we say 75 to 85% of all life's learning takes place in the first 3 years of life. So what happens if the first 3 years of life have been terrible? What happens if the first 3 years of life you've removed from your caretaker, put back, removed, neglected, abused, go into a foster home, go to multiple foster homes? All of this is going to affect your ability. When we say bonding must be present during the first year of life, everybody has something, even if it's pathogenic. Bonding has to, everybody is going to have some kind of connection to somebody. So we don't want to represent to adoptive parents that your children didn't have good care, so they cannot attach to you. This is why we do not use reactive attachment disorder as a diagnosis. Because there are very, very few kids who actually meet that diagnosis. Even in the DC 0 to 5, I don't know if you've got that manual, it has reactive attachment disorder in there. And the DSM has got reactive attachment disorder in there. But under each one of those pages, it says this is a very rare finding, and we don't really use it. I had a situation a couple of weeks ago where, and this does happen, somebody went off to a conference and met another professional at that conference, and that professional wanted to know if Circle of Friends worked with reactive attachment disorder. And in trying to talk to the person who made the inquiry, I said, we work with disordered attachment because all of our kids in foster care have disordered attachment. Disordered attachment is not the same thing as reactive attachment disorder. And if you really look in the DSM, it's almost impossible to assign that diagnosis because everybody's got something. Even if they're raised by wolves, they've got something. So, and it's also a very misunderstood diagnosis. And in the 90s, when it first got really popular, adoptive parents, foster parents thought that this was the kiss of death. They thought that if you had reactive attachment disorder, you could never get better. That's not true. And I always say that when people come here and another therapist has told them that this kid that they adopted has reactive attachment disorder, the first thing we say to them is, no, that's not true. This child can learn how to attach to you. But is the attachment disordered right now? You bet it is. And this is from the New Yorker. It just says that kid we raised is tracking us. It's a couple of wolves. Everybody's got something. However, we do say that 0 to 1 is a really critical period for if you are looking at a history of a child and that child has been removed before the age of 1 or in the age of 1 in the first year of life, it absolutely affects kids' development. That brain is just wired and ready to go in the first year of life. And all of those brain systems that you need are all in the brain there. They're all ready. They just need to be developed. And when we say that it's the groundwork for empathy and conscience development and kindness and learning how to use your brain for the emotional development, all of that is there. But if you don't have anybody, if you don't have good care in the first year of life, you are not going to develop these things. I think of those kids in that Spitz video, especially the first little boy. These are really the kids who would have developed looking autistic, who would have not been able to really connect to other people. And I think we kind of overdiagnose autism now, but then we didn't even have the diagnosis. So kids who've had very little connection to other people are not going to know how to connect, how to read social cues. And isn't that autism? We're going to see like the little boy, the first one you saw who was sitting in the crib and had a stick or something in his hand. That doesn't mean that that kid is now 70 and probably might have ended up being a research librarian where he didn't have to spend a lot of time with other people. But we learn how to do all these things through interaction with our caretaker. And without that interaction, we are not going to learn how to do it. Is this the still face that you've seen? I bet it is.
I think I've seen this one, and there's a boy. I've seen this video for sure because I recognize that guy. But there's
This one is all over YouTube.
yeah, there's the mom has like brown hair. That I've seen that one too. But
All right, this is the still face experiment. So once you've seen the Spitz video with these kids who probably didn't live to be 2, I want you to look at how important and how connected this baby is to the mother. And I came into a conference one day. I got there late because I thought it started at 9 and it started at 8:30. But the conference presenter was having people pair up and do still face with each other. And it so unsettled the entire room that I walked in and I didn't know what was going on because the people who were holding the still face were okay. The people who had to stare at the still face had all been completely dysregulated. So don't try this at home. But and this one is on YouTube too. This is probably the most famous video for still face. Whoops. What happened here?
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In this still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing. It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
I really like this video because this is when we talk about secure attachment. This is a mother and a baby that have a very secure attachment. And you can tell that because the still face experiment is a timed experiment. She only has to hold that for 2 minutes. And in 2 minutes, the baby very quickly learns that there's nobody coming. And she's not used to that. If in fact you have a situation where an infant isn't used to a parent interacting with them, the reaction to still face is very, very different. There's another YouTube video of this. If you Google still face, there's another one there where the mother had severe postpartum depression, and the baby is so unused to, the mother's trying to play with the baby, and she's trying to play with the baby's feet, and the baby's looking at her like, who are you? Because she was just so unused to this poor woman who was so depressed, trying to caretake her, that she didn't know what to do, so she didn't react. We see that this, I think, is a perfect one, because this really does show you what that secure attachment is and what happens when you stop it. If you look at the mother's face, I don't think she would have been able to hold the still face much longer, because she was beginning to react to her baby's distress, and how quickly that baby came back when she turned around. And that's really what we want to see. And again, when I say, if you think you're not important to your children, you certainly are. If you see something like this with obviously a connected mother and baby, and then you take that connection away, even for 2 minutes, it has an effect on the baby. Now, what Dr. Tronick is saying is that with this little baby, the second the mom turned back around, that baby reconnected with her. She lost all of her sadness. She stopped being distressed. She started to play again. And all was right with the world. But with babies that just don't get that, there is no coming back from this. So it's a good video, and you can just Google still face on YouTube. You'll find a bunch of them, but this one really is the best one. You'll also find one of the, if you Google mirroring, there's a lot of little videos of caretakers trying to mirror with brand new babies, of trying to like stick out their tongue, and then the baby will stick out its tongue, because the baby is now so connected with that caretaker that the baby is going to do what the caretaker does. And like I said, you don't have to try this at home, but if you want to just see what a connection is, that's what you're looking for, is a baby that can come back when the caretaker comes back. And they do screech. Remember when your babies used to screech like that? They screech to make that noise to wake you up. My son used to do that in the car. And when he was in the back seat in the car seat, and just screech out of nowhere, and you'd practically go to the roof. But and the other thing that babies do, and that baby did it, is point. We see babies pointing, because what does the mother do? The mother always looks at that speck on the wall that the baby's pointing at, and we don't know what she's pointing at, but so what happens if your child has had no bonding experiences during the first year of life? We can say that later efforts to repair may be unsuccessful, but this very rarely happens. And that is really important for you to say to adoptive parents. Disordered attachment isn't reactive attachment disorder. You can repair this. It would be very, very rare for a child to have absolutely no bonding experiences during the first year of life. There is it's on YouTube. I think it's called the Feral Child. I think the feral child is now probably in her 20s, but it was a child that was kept in, was either a closet or a shed. By a father. I don't know what happened to the mother because I'm not sure I have the whole story straight, but this child was found in, I think it was a shed. And this child really had absolutely nothing. And father did feed her, but that was about it. And she was removed. She was placed in a foster home. And the only reason I know this is that I was part of an area that I covered back in Massachusetts. And they were really attempted to really bring her along, but her brain was so underdeveloped that they got her as far as they could get her, and they couldn't get her any further. They were committed to her care, they were kind to her, but that was just a case of really extreme lack of connection and attachment, that they just weren't able to reverse it. Kind of like the little kids, the children that were in the dog cage, that we were able to bring them along to a certain extent, but it's rare for damage to be so extreme that you cannot bring it along. One thing that we do try to say to adoptive parents is that if you adopt a child, maybe the child is 10, but this child has had very little connection or attachment, and maybe this child is not going to be functioning like a normal 10-year-old. This child might be functioning like a 5-year-old, and it might take a while for you to bring that child to the age level that they need to be, especially if bonding has been interrupted at a very young stage of life. It just takes time. And we do very concrete things with our adoptive parents. We talk to them about just do what you say you're going to do. If you are trying to connect with a child who's had completely interrupted bonding and attachment in his young life, you just need to do very specific things, and it's not hard. And you don't need 4 initials after your name to do it. You need to be able to say, I'm going to make you chocolate chip cookies every Friday afternoon, and then you have to do it. I'm going to read you a book. And every night we're going to sit down at 7 o'clock. We're going to read a book together, and then you got to do it. You've got to be able to teach kids who've had no connection that there's a connection they can count on. So,
Barbara, you forgot to put on the recorder.
well, this is probably going to be one of my interrupted things, and I'm probably not going to try to do it now. Hold on.
Okay.
You see where I am. See, that's why I have Charmaine. Hold on a second, guys. Nope, it's still going.
Oh, I just don't show it.
We're in better shape than I think we are.
Good.
Thank you. Keep me honest.
Usually it shows me that it's recording, but it's not.
Yeah, this one doesn't. I don't.
Oh, now
That's
it is.
right. I think I've messed up, and then I find out that I haven't. So, and let me just jump and see where I am here. And then I'm going to give you guys a lunch break. Okay, when we say loss of caretaker affects conscience development, it doesn't mean they can't develop a conscience. It doesn't mean that they can't learn all these things. And I stress that because one of the holdovers from reactive attachment disorder in the 90s was that people do believe that if you have this diagnosis, that you cannot develop a conscience. That is not true. Any of the damage, most of the time, that is incurred in the early years of life can be repaired. Do I see kids that don't analyze danger? Yeah, these are not kids that are aware of the danger inherent in certain things. There are kids that are hyperactive and hypervigilant all the time, but they don't seem to have the ability to logically think and say, maybe I shouldn't do that. And what that leads to is kids getting hurt. Of the of the kids that I had when I first moved to Florida in the late 90s, I worked in a group home and I had 8 girls in one of the cottages, and they were like 13 to 15. And that was 20 some odd years ago. Of those 8 girls, 3 of them are now dead. Are they dead because they got sick? They're dead because one of them got on a motorcycle and was killed that way. One of them was in a car accident driving drunk through the Ocala State Forest. Um, when you look at these kids years later and see how they developed or didn't develop, you realize that these were kids that were at this point in a group home in the 90s that had very little connection to their caretakers. And they didn't have the ability to soothe themselves. There was a lot of blowing up. There was a lot of screaming. They didn't have any ability to tolerate any kind of stress in their life at all because they didn't know how to regulate themselves, but they also didn't know how to analyze danger. And that it took me a while to figure out, why are these kids at this stage? Do I know that 3 of them are gone? And then you think back to their lives and think back to what I've learned over the years about the impaired attachment and what it does. And I say, oh, okay, that's why. All right, I think we're going to, let's stop here. And all right, I'm going to stop this recording and you better tell me to start it again. Okay, to begin with, this little girl was not a professional actress when she filmed this. And if we have time next week, there's a sequel to this. And it does wrap the story up, but it gets worse before it gets better, but it does wrap the story up. But if you've ever been involved with removals, and I have, this is exactly the way they go. You not always do you see the police coming in and taking down the domestic abuser. That doesn't happen all that, but it did happen in this. But when the police came in to arrest the guy, what did the mother do?
Tried to get him back.
Yeah, she chased after him. And she didn't pay any attention to where her kids were. She chased after him. I think if I can show you the sequel next week, you kind of discover that this is generational, that she wasn't raised by anybody herself and got involved with a domestic violence and substance abuse situation. But when you saw her chasing after the policeman, where did you see Zoe go? You remember where she went?
She was running outside, but I don't know where she was. I thought she would be checking on the brother, but I don't.
She was running away.
Yeah.
She was trying to get away from the social worker. The poor social workers are always depicted like this too. And she having to chase after somebody and grab her. But some of it is dark, some of it is hard to see. But so the social worker grabs her, he puts her in the car, and she has her baby brother in her hands. And then what happens?
He takes the baby away from her.
He takes the baby away from her. And in many, many cases, after removals, kids will tell you that the worst part of the whole thing was being separated from their siblings, not knowing, especially if it's a baby, not knowing where the baby went, not knowing what happened. I mean, this little girl was the caretaker for her baby brother. And so he's removed from her. She does what? What does she predictably do in the foster home?
Rants and raves.
Acts up. I'm not sure why they chose the turntable, because obviously we haven't seen turntables in houses in years, because this is only a couple years old. But perhaps it was because this was a prized possession of these people. But you kind of see that there are foster parents who are ill-guided. There are. I mean, these foster parents were ill-guided to do what they did to her, to stick her in the shower and pour the water on her and try to calm her down that way. So we get to the second foster home. And did you see any difference in the way that second foster mother greeted her.
Well, she was much more positive.
She was much more positive. She got down on eye level. She smiled. She said, "I'm so glad you're here." And what you did see with Zoe is that she began over months to begin to calm down, to begin to get used to the fact that she was there. And what happened with the dress? What?
It triggered her.
It triggered her. It triggered her to remember the father. I don't think that was her father. I think it was the mother's boyfriend, beating up the mother because she had a new dress on. It triggered her to react and to reject the foster parent. I will tell you that this video and the subsequent video were made by a couple of foster parents. They weren't professional filmmakers, so I don't know how this came out as good as it did. By the time they got to the second one, I think they had some professional help, but the second one is equally well produced. And the baby is their baby. He plays Bediah, the baby. But when she was triggered by the foster mom, the difference that you saw with the ones that threw her in the shower and the second foster mom is that the second foster mom understood where the anger was coming from, understood where the outbursts were. So when Zoe reacted as she did with the foster mom and screamed at her and said, you know, "I hate you and I don't want the stress," she ran away, ran into her room and came out and saw the foster mom on the phone. And what did she assume that foster mother was doing?
Gonna send her back?
Yeah.
I thought it's interesting though, she put the dress on
Right?
and like, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I see it with my clients all the time. Like, she saw the foster mom was upset and took it upon herself. Like, she's way too young to take on that much and decided, okay, I'm gonna make this right. I'm gonna put on the dress, even though it triggers me. And it's almost like, I feel like my clients, they've been so parentified and they've been treated like adults so much that like, that's not her responsibility to fix that, but she tried to fix it anyway. It's just interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear what Rebecca said, but what she said is absolutely true. This is a parentified little girl. She blew up. She didn't want to hurt this foster mother because this foster mother had been nice to her. So she put the dress on to try to make up for it. Was it her job to take care of the foster mother? No, but a lot of our kids in foster care are very parentified children, and they're used, especially if they've been used to caretaking their younger siblings, they do assume that caretaking role. And you see in the second video how she continues to assume that caretaking role and eventually allows this foster mother to take care of her. But what she thought that the foster mom was calling to put a 30-day notice in to send her away. So it ends with a hopeful note, certainly with Bediah being placed in the foster home with her. And like I said, there is a sequel. It's called Remember My Story, and it does wrap this video up. But it's extremely well done because that is exactly what happens. Kids do react in anger. Kids do get triggered. Foster moms and parents don't always know what's triggering them. This particular foster parent was a teacher. She had a lot of patience, and she understood that Zoe was probably missing her brother. So I wanted you to see it because if you've never been involved directly with a referral or with a removal, I think removals can be just as traumatic for the people doing the removing. I can remember my removals. I can remember most of them. I can remember what I had to do. I can remember going home and crying. It's a really tough thing to do. And I think I might have said to you last week or one of the other sessions, I was working in Massachusetts. It's cold in Massachusetts in the winter. And I had more than one occasion where I would be removing a baby and I would have to try to talk this mother into giving me a snowsuit so I could take the baby out in the cold, and trying to convince this mother that she needed to take care of the baby. Well, they don't always take care of the baby. I had one mother who threw the snowsuit in my face and wouldn't let me put it on the baby. She was scared, she was angry. They're difficult situations. So, but the removal is not the end of the story. The removal is the beginning of the story. Because once their kids are removed, then very often triggering behaviors, upset behaviors, angry behaviors cause them to be moved from place to place to place. And we don't always have that kind of understanding foster mom that we saw here who said, I think if I get her brother back, this will make things better. So, so that is removed. And I do think if you want to go on YouTube, I think Remember My Story is still up. I think you can watch it. You just can't monetize it, as they say. So that's why I can't include it in the recording, because if I did, it would block the recording. You have to be careful with YouTube. I thought it was a news article about white parents adopting Black children. It was 3 minutes long, and I had it in the thing that I was going to show you last week, and YouTube blocked it. And when sometimes if they have a copyright, they'll block the whole thing. They don't just block that part. So I had to take it out. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to put it up. So that's why I wanted to make sure that that I stopped the recording for that. So. And I think that little girl was really pretty remarkable, considering that she wasn't a professional. She gets to be a professional by the second one. I think maybe she had other roles in the meantime, so. Right, I forget where we left off here. I think we've already done this slide. Okay, when we look at what happens to the infant brain, when I say that trauma imprints itself in implicit memory, all that means is that those memories are there, but you can't unlock them because you have no language to attach to them. What we see with our kids who have had early trauma, it's harder for them to work through it because they can't give it words. It's harder for them to recognize this is what is upsetting me. If Zoe was a real little girl and we had her in front of us, I think Rebecca's exactly right. I don't think that we would have sat as a therapist with Zoe and said, tell me what happened when you put the dress on. I think what we would have seen was that she would have said, I didn't want her to be mad and tell me that I had to go. So for a lot of our kids, they just can't remember what happened. And our brains get hardwired for trouble when we have trauma. For those of you who, I don't know if any of you work in group homes or if you go to group homes or just working with kids in foster care, there's something that happens in the brain with trauma. When you have something happen that scares you, say you're walking down the street and there's a car coming right at you and you have to get out of the way, your adrenaline level is going to shoot up, your cortisol level is going to shoot up, but then, okay, you're safe, you didn't get hit by the car, and you will calm down. Your cortisol level will come back down, your adrenaline level will come back down, and you will calm down. What happens with our kids is that they have these shots of cortisol all the time in their brain. And after a while, they don't come all the way back down. What does that look like? That means that that is a kid that's hardwired for trouble, hardwired for something bad to happen to them. High levels of cortisol can kill developing brain cells. So there's a real lasting damage that goes on physiologically, scientifically, if you as a baby are repeatedly exposed to trauma. What is the chemical that makes us feel better? Serotonin. Serotonin makes us feel good. That's why after Thanksgiving dinner, everybody's got a nice shot of serotonin, everybody falls asleep because everybody's calm and happy then. With trauma that goes on and on and on, the cortisol level stays up and the serotonin level stays down. And there's that continuous sense of danger. The reason I put actually it's a note for me, children of Iraq, is that I found a picture in the news and then I couldn't find it again. But if you think about kids in war-torn countries right now, kids that are in Gaza, kids that are in the Ukraine, kids who've gone through generations and years of war, have that continuous sense that something is always off. But the picture that I found that I couldn't find again it was a picture of a little boy in Iraq, and he was swinging on a swing, and underneath him were rows of bodies and body bags that were going to be pushed into a mass grave. And this little boy was swinging because this has become his new norm. And one really does have to wonder what happens to those children as they grow up in these very dangerous environments where there's always danger and they are not calming down and they are not getting any kind of sense of safety, that after a while it becomes who they are. So what have we learned about the effects of trauma on the brain? We know that chronic stress is going to alter the brain, and we know that kids are just going to be hypervigilant all the time. When I worked at the group home, and this is a long time ago, I just always remember what happened, is that I was sitting in my office one day, and I looked out the window, and there were a bunch of kids, they were like 7th grade, and they were sitting taking a break. They were apparently doing some kind of work around the campus with landscaping, and they were taking a break and they were talking to each other and playing. And I looked at them and I thought, those are not our kids. Where did these kids come from? And one of the supervisors said, oh, they were kids from one of the public schools. They were there on like a work thing. Why did I know they weren't our kids? Because they were just sitting there playing. They weren't looking around. They weren't scanning the environment for danger. If you look at kids, especially you have kids in group home now, watch these kids in the group home. They're always scanning the environment for danger. They're always looking around. They're always looking to see what you're doing or what the kid next to them is doing. It's one of the difficulties. We were working in a group home in Daytona. I had a therapist going up to a group home up in Daytona for a while. I don't think it's there anymore, but it served developmentally delayed boys. It was a very difficult population, but they were all dependency kids. They'd all been exposed to extreme trauma. And the therapist came back to me one day and said, all right, I've got to get them to stop putting these kids on the basketball court, because they would get on the basketball court and they would start to play basketball. Well, normal kids can play basketball, hit each other, run away, move. These kids, if one kid hit another kid, everybody blew up. Everybody was blown up all the time. And the poor group home person, I don't think quite realized that he was setting this ricochet up every time he sent them out on the basketball court. So kids who have had extreme trauma, they're just always looking for danger, and they can't calm themselves down. Are you all familiar with the ACE test, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Test? It sounds like you are. I'm sorry, Charmaine?
I'm not familiar with that. Mm-mm.
Okay, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Test is a really simple test. It's 10 questions, and it's been around now for quite a while. I'm guessing over 20 years, but it's one of the biggest studies that's ever been done on the effects of trauma on the physical and mental health of people. It was started out of I believe it was a Boston hospital by Dr. Vincent Folletti. And what happened at the beginning of ACE was that these were people that were coming in that had eating disorders, and they were given this test to take. It was 10 questions. Have you ever been abused? Has anybody in your house ever abused alcohol? Have you ever witnessed domestic violence? It was basically 10 basic questions of trauma. And I will send you all the ACE test because what I'd like you to do is give it to yourself. And most people are going to come in 4 and under. But if you gave the ACE test to any of the kids that you're working with, you would find that they would all score very, very high. I did this when I was doing a training at Florida United Methodist Children's Home for the childcare staff, not for the therapists, for the childcare staff. So I handed the ACE test out and I said, I want you all to think of a kid in your cottage and fill this out as if you are that kid. So we did it. And then I began to say, okay, you are that kid now. Who has a score of 1, 2, 3, 4? Nobody raised their hand. By the time I got up to 7 or 8, everybody's hands started to go up. Now, what are the implications of scoring high on an ACE test? It means that you're going to get sick more. You're going to have a much higher chance of developing heart disease, diabetes, having a stroke, becoming an alcoholic, becoming addicted. This is all because the immune system, excuse me, as the child matures and is subjected to a lot of trauma, the immune system becomes depressed. And it's a lot easier for you to get sick. If you are working with any of your kids or your adoptive parents or your foster parents, we always tell our adoptive parents not to take the kids off Sunshine because you can stay on Sunshine Child Welfare Insurance until you're 26 years old now, if you are adopted. But if you take that child off Sunshine and put him on Blue Cross isn't as forgiving about all of these issues. Sunshine will pretty much pay for everything. And what we try to say to adoptive parents are, your kids are going to get sick more. Our kids get sick more. If we look at our kids, they all have allergies, they've all got asthma, they've all got a lot of them are overweight. And we're not even talking about the mental health issues. We're talking about physical issues because incredible trauma is going to depress the immune system. And we think about, as we're all watching the situation in Gaza with these hostages, there are, I think, 5 children, if they're still alive, that are hostages and have been since last October. And if those children are able to be retrieved alive, it will be hopefully a study as to how they develop as they get older. Because I have no doubt that these children, again, if they're still alive, we don't know who's still alive over there, but if they are retrieved, if they are saved after all the months that they have been exposed to the trauma that we're told they're being exposed to, can they be helped? Yes. But will there be very long-term implications for those kids? There certainly will. Now, the good news, because I feel like I bombard you with bad news here, the good news is that these kids can be helped. We can help our kids. We can help solve this, but we have to recognize that there are physiological and emotional and mental implications to chronic trauma. And this is just another representation of what's happening in the traumatized brain, because what happens in the whole survival state is that people have to wonder if they're safe. But most of what happens with your kids is stuck right here. These are the kids that don't remember what happened to them, do remember what happened to them, but don't remember it clearly, know that something happened to them, and don't understand why they never feel safe. A lot of our kids just do not feel safe. And when we open up our cases here, almost always when we write a treatment plan, the first problem we're looking at is making kids feel safe. And it's not terribly complicated. If we have very young children, for example, and we are trying to open them and try to serve them, when we set up a treatment plan, it can be very simple things. It can be, what do you need to feel safe at night? Do you need a comfort animal? Do you need the foster mom to read you a story? Do you need her to check the closet and make sure there's nobody in the closet? Whatever they say is going to make them feel safe is what we put on our treatment plan. As they get a little bit older, they get a little more sophisticated, but with the little kids, a lot of times safety is just making sure that there's nobody under the bed, that the foster mom is always going to be there if I need her to be, that she's going to hear me if I call. So we have to really look at safety before we get up here and start worrying about how am I going to solve this problem. That's why we do so much work with expressive therapy before we ever get to talking to these kids about what happened to them. We do a lot of sand tray. We do a lot of art. We do a lot of role play. We have play therapy rooms in all of our offices that have all kinds of things set up that if you want to come in and use the play therapy room, there's a sand tray there. There's a YouTube channel. There's a kitchen. There's a puppet theater. There's a dollhouse. All things that we can use to help people say, okay, I think I feel safe now. And now it's safe for me to tell you what happened. But it doesn't happen overnight. Another thing that you have to help adoptive parents to understand. So again, this is the same thing I just said. The brain is going to operate from the bottom up, but we are going to get stuck in survival mode. Our kids get stuck in survival mode. When I show you the second video with Zoe, she gets stuck in survival mode in all the typical ways. Did you want to say something?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. You were just breathing in?
Yes.
Okay, no problem. All of the above and everything that we talked about, that's why treatment has got to take place within the caretaker-child relationship. And that's why we say to adoptive parents, we don't want to see your kids in school. We want to see your kids with you. It doesn't mean that we might not see the child alone for a session or the parent alone for a session, but what's going to help all of these kids heal is a successful caretaker-child relationship. And it does take a while. If you go back to the beginning of this training, the things that kids have got to learn as babies, besides emotional regulation and the ability to interact, is the ability to trust this caretaker is going to take care of me. And most of these kids have had interrupted attachment. So learning to trust a caretaker is a huge, huge part of the healing process. And it can't be underestimated. And that's why I always try to say to the adoptive parents, you're the most important part of this healing. It's not me. It's not the therapist. It's not the teacher in school. You are the most important part of this child's healing because you're the one that's going to teach this child what caretaking is all about. So here's what we tell caretakers to expect. We tell them to expect a child that looks like he has ADHD. We also tell them not to rush to meds because it's really easy for adoptive parents to want to rush this kid to a psychiatrist and give him meds to calm him down. We certainly want our parents to expect the kids to be hyper vigilant. They're going to react in ways that we don't understand. When Rebecca was talking about her 9-year-old destroying the house and then going and sitting down, I have no doubt that kid was dissociating because that's the safest thing to do after you've had something like that happen. And it doesn't mean that she's psychotic. It just means she took herself to a place where she was calmer and probably didn't know she was doing it.
Yeah.
But we often see our kids, when we say dissociating, we mean they look like they're not paying attention, but they've just taken themselves to a safe place. And we've certainly had kids talk about that. I had a long time ago, an adult client who had been, she was actually a special needs teacher, and she had been severely tortured by a father who used to put her in a basket and lock her in, and he wouldn't let her out. And she talked about, while she was in the basket, going someplace else where she wasn't there. And she talked about being on the ceiling and looking down at herself and saying, okay, I can see somebody's in the basket, but it's not me. There's a lot of safety sometimes for kids in dissociating. I think our adoptive parents or our foster parents, or sometimes we think that this is maladaptive, but it's really, it saves kids from very severe situations. And what else can we expect? We can expect these kids are not going to see you as a nurturer. They're not going to see adults as there to take care of them. That comes, it does come in time, but you got to give it time. And we have to expect these kids are not going to look like they have great conscience development. It doesn't mean that they can't develop a conscience. It means nobody's taught them. Who teaches you right from wrong? It's your caretaker. When you're a little kid and you're on the playground and you knock Johnny down, mommy's going to say, honey, don't do that. That's not what we want to do. That's not being a good boy or girl or whatever it is that your mother said to you. And you then learned maybe there's a right way to behave and a wrong way to behave. But we don't come into this world knowing that. We have to have that all-important caretaker to help with all of that stuff. If you look at your own parents, and I won't ask you, but if I asked you to think, how would you describe perhaps your mother or your father? And say you remembered your mother and said she was just always kind to people who were poor. She was always kind to people who didn't have as much as we had. She was the first one to invite somebody over for Christmas if they didn't have anybody with them. What did you learn from your mother? You learned kindness and consideration of others. But if your mother was an opioid addict who didn't take care of you and didn't feed you and shoved you in a closet, and you didn't see her from one end of the day to the next, and you weren't taken care of, that's what you would have learned from your parent. We learn from our parents. So if you have had a child who's had terrible experiences, you as the adoptive parent have got to reverse those experiences. And you can't expect this to be a pretty slow process. And I always say that because then if it's quick, they're surprised and they think, oh, that's great, I did good. But it is a slow process. And here's what we can do. We can help our adoptive parents to understand that this is the trauma, this isn't the kid's fault. And we can always avoid judging the negative behaviors. One of the difficulties that we often have with very inexperienced new adoptive parents is that they want their kids to, quotes, behave. And behaving is not the end all and be all of the world. And we've had really well-meaning new adoptive parents, and you go in for the session and they've got chore charts and they've got consequences written down. And if the child does this, then this is what I do. Because we as new adoptive parents want to be seen as successful. So how do we measure our success? We want our kids to be, quotes, good. But negative behaviors are not a lack of character. Negative behaviors come from what's happened to the child. We're all the sum of our days. And if you're adopted at 6 and the first 5 years of your life have been horrible, you may have developed some adaptive behaviors to keep yourself safe. And those adaptive behaviors may take a while. And this is the one that everybody thinks is so simplistic, but this is the way this is. Set up regular caretaking routines. If you are trying to reteach a child who's had no good care in his life that you're there and you're dependable, set up caretaking routines and then keep them. And that sounds so simple, but it isn't. All you have to do is be consistent. If you, and I know that some people think that this is simplistic, but if kids haven't been fed consistently, if kids didn't have a bed to sleep in, if there wasn't anybody there to tell them what to do or to watch their game, watch them at their football game or whatever, you have to become that person. So if you say you're going to read them a story, read them a story. If you say you're going to make chocolate chip cookies, then make chocolate chip cookies. If you tell them that you're going to come and watch their soccer game, then go and watch their soccer game. And after a while, you may find that they begin to accept you as their caretaker, but it just is not fast. And that's always trying to say to adoptive parents, give it some time. And in the meantime, don't be judging yourself, because these kids were not raised the way you were. So what do we have to do? We have to help caregivers understand this. We have to put them through this training. We have to help them to understand that trauma is going to affect their brain development. And we have to help them to understand that when your kid gets stressed, that thinking brain is going to shut down. I don't know with Rebecca's grandmother if she's quite there yet, but maybe she can be with some education.
Yeah, I've sort of pared down upstairs brain, downstairs brain with the girls, but I haven't talked to grandma about it yet, so maybe I will. But
It really, you know, we don't want to sound preachy and we don't want to look like
Yeah.
we're teaching them, but we want caregivers to understand that there's a real reason why kids do the things that they do. Under stress, kids are not thinking. Under stress, kids are just acting. Their feeling brain is completely taken over, and that's why they're reacting to things. Just think about yourself. Think about something that happened to you where you were very frightened, or I can tell you, I think one day earlier this week, somebody sent me an email about something that I don't need to go into, but when I first read it, it made me really mad. And so I set it aside, and I looked at it a couple of hours later and I said, is this the same email? Because I didn't immediately flare up. I immediately flared up when I read it the first time, and I was angry, and I said, how can this person say this to me? And this is ridiculous, and this makes me angry. And then I went back a couple of hours later when I had calmed down, and I read it, and I thought, maybe this is a different email, because I don't think that I read this right at all the first time. But what happened to me? My thinking brain went offline, and my feeling brain got pissed. And then when I calmed down, everything reversed and I could think again. So if I can do it, you can do it. We can all do it. We have to help caregivers respond to the triggers instead of the behaviors, and just recognize that the kids are not bad. They're reacting to things that happen to them. And the most important thing we always want our adoptive parents to know is that they are the healing agent for these kids. They have to understand that they have a lot of power in this relationship to heal this kid. And that's why we say there's no such thing as a baby. There's a baby and someone, because we are the someone. You, the adoptive parent, are the someone, and you can help these kids heal. We're honestly, therapists are the least important thing in this equation. We are the least important thing in this equation. The important parts of this equation are the child and the caretaker. Learning what to expect of each other, learning how to work with each other. Just like in the still face, you watched that mother and that baby, they just completely coordinated what they wanted to do. And when the mother changed the rules of the game, the baby lost her mind. And when the mother went back to the rules of the game, everybody was happy again. There wasn't any therapist in that situation. We are the least important thing here. And I think we already talked about this. The types of treatments that work best are not necessarily what you think. The types of treatment that work best for the first couple of months of almost any kid's treatment is just anything that works that makes kids feel calm and safe. And that depends on the age of the child. It depends on, with older kids, you can do other things. You can do journaling. You can do, excuse me, role play. There's a lot of things that you can do. With our little kids, we just do a lot of calming activities. Excuse me. If you look up on our YouTube channel, under the playlist, there's a playlist on there for, I believe it's called Self-Regulation. And in there is a yoga book called Good Night Yoga. And it's a wonderful book for calming kids down. A lot of the therapists used to use it at the beginning of the session or the end of the session, because as she reads the book, it's such a soothing kind of yin yang as I breathe in, as I breathe out. That's been very popular with our therapists in learning with the little ones what to calm down. Some kids will tell you that they like to play music. Some kids will tell you that they like to dance. Maybe they like to draw. We kind of take our cues from them, and when they begin to show us that they are repairing and that they are beginning to calm down, then we move into the more abstract things like cognitive behavioral therapy. But you gotta lay the groundwork for that first. These are all the things that we use to address trauma triggers. And we use this first row the most. If you're trained in EMDR, you should use it. It's a wonderful technique. I leave brain spotting up here. I sat through 5 hours of brain spotting. I have absolutely no idea what that's about, but it was a pretty complicated, something about I can't even begin. I sat through a 5-hour training and I got done and I thought, I have no idea what that guy just said. So, but I left it up there. Clinical hypnosis is the one thing in Florida. You cannot use clinical hypnosis unless you are trained in it and certified in it. Anything else that you want to try, that you feel comfortable and you see getting some benefit for your clients, use it. You don't need to be a certified art therapist or a certified play therapist or a level 2 sand tray therapist in order to use those techniques. They're just interventions. They're just techniques. And if you can use them and find that they're benefiting your client, then use them. Like I said, hypnosis is the only one you have to be trained in. And when EMDR first hit the scene in the 90s, Francine Shapiro developed EMDR. It is a great technique, but it's just a technique. And the EMDR International Association got their hands on EMDR and said, okay, we are the only ones that can train you in this. You cannot use this unless we train you. And it was rather expensive. But since that time, other Green Tree, PESI, other training agents have come along and have trained people in EMDR, and it has allowed it to get into the more vernacular of what we do, and it is a wonderful technique. But a lot of what we do in the beginning is this. It's play, art, reading the books, doing sand tray, and that has the benefit of calming kids down. And why does that? Because when I say the feeling brain, I'm talking about the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the feeling part of your brain. It's what flares everything up. If you use some of these calming techniques, if you use yoga, if you read them a book, if you play them some music, if you do some kind of exercises with them, it deactivates the sympathetic nervous system, and it allows the parasympathetic, which is the calm part of your brain, to take over. And once that happens, you're able to do a lot more with your clients. That's why we call sympathetic fight or flight and parasympathetic rest and digest. It just helps everybody to calm down. And I'm honestly spending a little time with this because I think a lot of us, when we are fairly new to this game, feel like we've got to be Sigmund Freud, and we're not. There's a lot that we do that foster parents will say, well, all you did was play with them. We have certainly heard that a lot. All you did, like they come in every week and all they do is play with them. We have we know why we're doing what we're doing. And sometimes it does help if you sit down with the caretaker and say, this is why we're going to do this today. This is why we're going to do sand tray. This is why we're going to play with Play-Doh, although I wouldn't suggest that. People hate get Play-Doh on their floors, but if you explain to your foster parents what you're doing, or your adoptive parents, there's a reason that you're playing. And then when you get the thinking brain back online, then go ahead. You want to do TFCPT, you want to do DBT, you want to do motivational interviewing, you can do all that stuff once they can think. But kids have to be able to think. They have to be able to access this part of their brain. Almost everybody goes through the TFCPT. When they first get into the field, everybody goes through that 10 module thing online. It's a great thing. It used to be free. I don't think it costs very much now. It might cost $35 now. But for years and years and years, that was up there, and it was a 10 module training, and it had a lot of videos, and it talked you through TFCPT, which is trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And at the end, you got a little certificate. It's a great starting place once you are ready to move into the thinking brain part of therapy. These are all the types of treatments that foster attachment. And the reason, if you look at all of those are all within the context of family. Child parent psychotherapy is the big one, CPP. It's expensive. You have to take the training. You have to be supervised by a CPP therapist for 6 months. And trust me when I tell you, if you get into those groups, they only want you to do CPP. But it is a highly effective evidence-based treatment. Parent-child interactive therapy. Again, these are all evidence-based treatments. Parent-child interactive therapy is it's pretty prescribed, and it's a little bit more complicated to use. It involves certain things that not everybody has, like a one-way mirror, or the ability to observe children. But these are all very effective techniques for helping families learn how to attach with each other. Dyadic therapy is just what it says it is. It's just caretaker and child, filial play therapy, family play therapy. They're all kind of similar models. They just all involve the family working together. We don't do this in individual work. So we are coming to the end of module 4, and you haven't seen module 4 because I didn't use it, but module 4 has a little teeny part of attachment in it, and that's all it has, which is why I don't use it as much anymore as I used to. Because if you don't understand the connection and the all-important connection between a child and the caretaker, you're not going to be successful in this work. A lot of it is education. A lot of it is just kind of trying to calm people down to say, this is just, give it time. Give it time. If you adopted a kid at 10, it took them 10 years to get this way. They're not going to undo it in a couple of weeks. We really, really have to be patient working with our kids. And we have to be patient as therapists. Sometimes we think we should be fixing them right away. We can't fix them right away. We can't have them be with us forever, but sometimes I think therapists are a little hard on themselves in feeling that they have to make these things work immediately, and we don't. So when I say early trauma can affect the developing brain, it doesn't mean we can't reverse it, and we do reverse it. So I want you all to kind of go home with that positive message for the weekend, because we do see a lot of tough stuff in our field. We do see a lot of disruption. We see kids like Rebecca's kid ripping up the bed sheets. I mean, we see kids that have been so hurt and so traumatized, and they don't know where to go with their anger, and they don't know how to calm down, and they don't trust adults to take care of them. So what would we expect of children other than what we see in front of us? It's really our job, especially those of us who are on this training, is to help teach the parents that it's okay, and we can make this go away. We can work together. We can make this go away. It's just going to take a little time. So that will conclude today. Does anybody have anything that they would like to add to this? Do you want to see the second episode of Zoe's Life next week?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it really does. It brings it together nicely. You got anything? I was telling Rebecca before, when everybody came in for these trainings, they lasted a lot longer for 2 important reasons. Number one, I had to give everybody an hour and 15 minutes for lunch because everybody had to go out. And so it made the day longer. But as a trainer, having to adjust to Zoom trainings, we just don't get the interaction with people that we had when everybody was in the room. So when you do participate, I most appreciate it because we just don't have, there's a certain quality to Zoom trainings that we don't have. I mean, that Zoom just cannot replace in-person trainings. And I hope eventually we'll get back to in-person, but I can see that the world changed irrevocably during the pandemic, and I don't know how long it's going to take to ever reverse itself, if it ever does. So in the meantime, we've kind of agreed that we'll continue with Zoom. But please know that any interaction or anything you need to add or want to add, I'm more than happy to hear it, because it helps me to know if I'm getting my message across to you, because you're not in front of me. So when people are in front of me, I can see their knees jiggling, and I can see their breath intaking, and I can see them looking bored, or I can see them going, oh yeah, I understand that. But it's not the same with Zoom. We all do our best, but it's not the same. So next week will be the final. You guys have all been here for all of it. And I think we did lose Maritza early in the game. Her child got sick and she wasn't able to come back, so she's gonna jump on the next one. But you should all be able to finish by next week. All right, everybody have a lovely weekend.
You too.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.